There is a shot near the end of an early episode of Rick and Morty where two people stand in a suburban backyard at night, filling in a grave. The bodies going into that grave are a Rick and a Morty, and the two people doing the burying are also a Rick and a Morty, near enough identical that no one will ever be able to tell the difference. The same face filling in the dirt over its own face. That is the moment the series quietly tells you what it actually is, and I think almost nobody clocks how dark it is on a first watch. Tonight, we are going through every death in Rick and Morty that matters, from that backyard grave all the way to the one loss Rick and Morty decided could never be undone. This is Paper Town, so get comfortable, turn the lights down low, we will be here a while, and if you haven't subscribed yet, it genuinely does help us keep making these. Let me start where the whole idea of death in this show gets rewritten because you cannot understand any of the deaths that follow without it. It happens in the 6th episode of the first season, an episode called Rick Potion number 9, and it is the single most important half hour in the series for what we are doing tonight. The setup is small and stupid, which is the point. Morty wants a girl at school to like him, a girl named Jessica, and he badgers Rick into making him a love serum. Rick, who cannot be bothered to do anything carefully, brews something from vole DNA, and the serum works far too well. It spreads through Jessica, then through the whole school, then through the town, then across the planet, because it turns out to be airborne and it latches onto flu season. Everyone on Earth becomes obsessed with Morty. Rick tries to fix it, and every fix makes it worse until the entire human population has been mutated into twisted, gnarled, praying mantis creatures the series calls Cronenbergs, after the director who made a career out of body horror. This is the part that resets everything. Rick cannot fix it. He tries and he fails and he simply gives up on the whole planet. And then he tells Morty something that lands like a joke and turns out to be the load-bearing wall of the entire series. He says it does not matter because there are infinite universes, and in infinite universes, there is a version of this Earth that is exactly the same in every way, except that it's Rick and it's Morty happened to solve the Cronenberg problem and then died in a freak accident in their garage right afterward. So Rick opens a portal and the two of them walk into a world identical to the one they ruined, a world with the same house, the same Beth, the same Summer, the same Jerry, all of them grieving a Rick and a Morty who just died. And our Rick and our Morty drag the corpses out to the backyard and they bury them and they take their places at the dinner table and no one ever knows. Notice how casually this happens because the tone is what makes it so unsettling. There is no dramatic music. Morty is sobbing. Rick is annoyed that Morty is sobbing. The show treats the death of an entire species and the quiet swapping of one boy for a dead copy of himself as a Tuesday. This is the mechanic that every death in this series either obeys or deliberately breaks. Death for a Rick and a Morty is usually just a scheduling problem because if this pair dies, there is another pair one universe over and another behind that, out to infinity. The horror this series keeps circling back to is not that people die. It is that dying stopped meaning anything a long time ago. There are a couple of things worth getting exactly right here because people get them wrong constantly and it changes how you read the next 80 episodes. The dimension our Rick and Morty came from, the one they Cronenberged and abandoned, is Morty's actual original home. And much later, Rick and Morty confirms, in a way I will get to, that our Morty never leaves that origin behind the way Rick does. The pair we follow from this episode onward are not a match set from the same world. They are a Rick from one place and a Morty from another, stapled together by a lie and a shovel, living in a third house that belongs to neither of them. Everything that looks like a family in this show is standing on top of that grave. When people call the show nihilistic, this is usually the scene they are pointing at, and I think they are half right and half missing it, because the series is not saying nothing matters. It is showing you two people who have decided nothing matters, and then spending 8 seasons quietly proving them wrong. Before that backyard grave, the first season had already been quietly filling its margins with corpses, and most of them are played for a laugh so quick you forget they happened. The 3rd episode of Rick and Morty is a good example. It is called Anatomy Park, and it is built on a very silly premise, which is that Rick has shrunk himself down and built a microscopic theme park inside the body of a living human host. The host is a homeless man named Ruben, whom Rick pays to lie still on Christmas while Morty gets miniaturized and injected inside him. The park is themed around organs and diseases, and the trouble starts when the diseases inside Ruben get out of containment. Bubonic plague, hepatitis, tuberculosis, all of them personified as monsters roaming the attractions. And while Morty and the park staff are fighting for their lives inside him, Ruben's body simply gives out. The infections overwhelm him and he dies, which means the entire park is now a collapsing corpse, and the people trapped inside have to escape a body that is shutting down around them. The staff deaths in that episode are the kind of thing the series would get much more careful about later, but here they are almost gleeful. A man named Pancho, one of the park employees, turns out to be a coward and a saboteur, and he falls to his death inside the dying body. Another staffer named Roger drowns, and I will just say the substance he drowns in is exactly what you would expect a man to drown in inside a human body, and leave it there. And Ruben himself gets the strangest send-off in the episode because once he is dead, his giant corpse is a biohazard. So Rick's solution is to launch the body into orbit, where it explodes over the town like a fireworks display while the family watches from the lawn, not knowing they are watching a man's remains come apart in the sky on Christmas. That image, a human being turned into holiday fireworks, is this series telling you early that it will find the joke in anything, and that the people dying in its margins do not get names remembered or graves dug. Ruben was kind to Morty. Nobody mourns him. The 5th episode gives us 2 deaths that matter more than they look, and it introduces a rule about death that Rick and Morty will lean on for years. The episode is Me Seeks and Destroy, and it has 2 halves. In one half, Rick hands the family a box, a Me Seeks box, and the rule is simple and horrifying once you think about it. You press the button, a blue creature named a Mr. Me Seeks pops into existence. It helps you with exactly 1 task, and then, the instant the task is done, it vanishes from existence. It is born to serve a single purpose and then to stop being. The family treats this as a convenience, but the episode reveals the catch. A Meeseeks that cannot complete its task keeps existing, and existence, for a creature built only to end, becomes unbearable. Jerry asks his Meeseeks to take 2 strokes off his golf game, fails to improve, and the Meeseeks starts spawning more Meeseeks to help it, and those fail too. And very quickly you have a swarm of blue creatures driven to the edge of murder by the simple agony of continuing to be alive past their purpose. It is a joke about golf that is secretly a small essay on why a life without an endpoint might be a kind of torture. I find it genuinely one of the sharper ideas Rick and Morty ever smuggled into a B-plot. The other half of that episode has Rick and Morty in a fantasy world, and it ends with a death that is pure, cold revenge. They befriend a giant sentient jellybean, a character the series calls King Jellybean, who runs a tavern. Morty goes to the bathroom alone, and the jellybean follows him in and tries to sexually assault him. Morty fights him off and gets out, shaken, and does not tell Rick what happened, though Rick clearly works it out. As they are leaving the world, Rick opens a portal, sees the jellybean, and shoots him dead through it without a word of explanation to Morty. It is one of the few times early on that Rick's casual violence reads as something like protectiveness, and Rick and Morty never spells it out, which is exactly why it lands. Morty never learns that Rick avenged him. Rick never tells him. It just sits there in the credits as one of the quietest, ugliest, most human things Rick ever does. And then the finale of the first season opens the door that the entire series will spend the next decade walking through. The episode is Close Rick Counters of the Rick kind, and it is the first time we learn that our Rick is not the only Rick. There is a whole society of them, a citadel and a council of Ricks, thousands of versions of the same man who have banded together for mutual protection and mutual surveillance. The plot kicks off because Ricks are being murdered. A killer is going from dimension to dimension executing Ricks, and the council frames our Rick, Rick C-137, for the crimes. It turns out the real culprit is another Rick, one operating a cybernetic puppet the series calls Evil Rick, and the Mortys being kept in that lair are wired together and used as a cloaking device, because, as we learn here, a Morty's brainwaves naturally camouflage a Rick's genius from detection. Mortys, in this world, are camouflage. That is what they are for. Something like 27 Ricks die in the course of that episode, murdered to build a frame job, and this series barely pauses on any of them because a dead Rick is the least special thing in the universe. But the reason this episode matters for everything ahead is the final reveal. Evil Rick was not the mastermind. He was a servant. The mind behind the whole operation was a Morty, a small, calm, one-eyed Morty who steps out from the crowd of freed captives, reaches up, removes the eye patch that was letting him control Evil Rick, and simply walks away into the crowd of identical boys, unseen. That is the first appearance of Evil Morty, and mark him now, because he is the thread that ties together half the deaths we are going to talk about tonight. He does not die in this episode. He does not die in any episode. Keep that in your pocket. Every time the body count in this show reaches its highest, look for the quiet Morty at the edge of the frame, because more often than not, he is the reason. The second season is where Rick and Morty starts to test how far it can push the idea that death is a punchline, and it does it first with a character who is nothing but that joke. His name is Krombopoulos Michael, and he appears in the second episode of the season, Morty Night Run. He is a small, cheerful alien who introduces himself to Rick as a professional assassin, and he says it with the delight of a man describing his favorite hobby. He tells Rick with a grin that he has no code, no ethics, he will kill anyone anywhere, and then he climbs into his little vehicle and says the line that made him a fan favorite in about 40 seconds of screen time that, oh boy, here he goes killing again. And almost immediately after, he is killed himself, flattened by Rick's spaceship on autopilot, reduced to a smear before he can carry out a single job in front of us. The show builds a whole charming personality just to erase it mid-sentence, and I think that is the joke it is actually making. It wants you to like him, and then it wants you to feel how little the universe cares that you did. But the death that gives Morty Night Run its weight is not Michael's. The target Michael was hired to kill is a being made of gas, a sentient cloud the show ends up calling Fart, voiced with this dreamy, ethereal calm by Jermaine Clement. Morty, being Morty, decides this creature is a beautiful, innocent life that deserves to be saved, and he defies Rick to smuggle it to freedom. In the process of protecting Fart, a running gun battle breaks out, and a genuinely large number of bystanders and guards are killed. Real deaths stacking up, all in service of Morty's conviction that he is doing the right thing. And then, at the very end, Fart telepathically shares its plan with Morty. Once it reunites with its own kind, it intends to wipe out all carbon-based life in the universe, because to a being of gas, carbon-based life is a kind of pollution. Morty realizes the thing he has been protecting is an extinction event with a soothing voice, and so he shoots it. He kills Fart with an antimatter gun, which means every person who died protecting it died for nothing. That is the cruelty the episode is built around. Morty tried to save one life and got a crowd killed and then had to take the life anyway. It is one of the show's cleanest arguments that good intentions in this universe are just another way to get people killed. The third episode of that season, Autoerotic Assimilation, is not really a death episode, but I want to mention it because of where it ends, and because it reframes how you should hear every glib thing Rick says about mortality. Rick reconnects with an old flame, a hive mind called Unity that controls entire planets through the bodies it possesses, and for a while he is happy, or something close to it. Then Unity leaves him, deciding that Rick is a bad influence even on a consciousness that spans worlds. Rick goes home, goes down to his garage, and builds a device to kill himself. He sets it up, he puts his head in position, and only passes out drunk before it can fire, so it does not go off. There is no joke to land on. The episode just ends on the smartest man in the universe having quietly tried to die and failed at even that. It is the series admitting, very early, that all of Rick's cheerful talk about death being meaningless is the language of a man who thinks about his own death constantly. Every time after this that he shrugs off a corpse, you are supposed to remember the garage. Then, in the fourth episode, Total Rickle, Rick and Morty plays a trick that I have to correct because people get it wrong all the time. The house is infested with alien parasites that spread by implanting fake memories. Every time someone remembers a fun old friend, that friend is real and standing in the room, a parasite made flesh, and the house fills up with them. Sleepy Gary, Mr. Beauregard the butler, a pencil man called Pencilvester, a samurai called Hamurai, a photography-themed raptor, a reverse giraffe, on and on, each one carrying a warm, invented history. The family works out the rule that saves them, which is that the parasites can only create pleasant memories. So anyone they can remember doing something genuinely unpleasant must be real. They start shooting anyone attached to a bad memory, and every parasite dies. It is a bloodbath of imaginary friends. But here's the correction, and it matters because this channel has caught heat for getting adjacent things wrong before. Beth shoots Mr. Poopy Butthole, convinced he is a parasite. He is not. He is a real, longtime friend of the family, and he survives the gunshot. Mr. Poopy Butthole does not die in Total Rickle, and he is not a parasite. He is one of the few genuinely innocent recurring figures in the whole show, and the joke of the episode is that the family nearly murdered the one guest who is actually their friend. The rest of the second season keeps escalating the scale of death until the numbers stop meaning anything, which is its own kind of point. In the 6th episode, The Ricks Must Be Crazy, we learn that Rick's car battery is powered by a miniature universe he created, a miniverse, full of intelligent life that has built an entire civilization whose sole unknowing purpose is generating power for Rick's vehicle. And inside that universe, a scientist named Zeep has done the exact same thing, built his own tiny universe to power his world, a teenyverse nested below. When Rick's arrangement is threatened, he simply destroys the miniverse, wiping out an entire cosmos of living beings, and by extension, the nested one below it, to protect his battery. Billions of lives gone to avoid a trip to the mechanic. And in the 9th episode, Look Who's Purging Now, Rick and Morty land on a planet that holds an annual festival where all crime, including murder, is legal for one night, and the two of them, alongside a resident named Arthritia, end up slaughtering the wealthy elite who run the whole bloody tradition for sport. The show is not subtle there, and it does not want to be. By the end of the 2nd season, it has taught you to watch entire populations die without flinching, which is exactly the muscle it is about to use against you. The finale of the 2nd season, The Wedding Squanchers, is where the series kills someone it actually wants you to grieve, and it is the first death in the series that carries real weight forward for years. The whole family travels off-world for the wedding of Rick's oldest friend, a stoic, hawk-headed warrior called Birdperson. Birdperson is important to understand before he dies, because he is the one person this series ever presents as Rick's genuine equal in friendship. A fellow veteran of some old galactic resistance movement, a man who speaks in slow, grave sincerity, and who has known Rick long enough to see through him and love him anyway. He is marrying a human woman named Tammy, a friend of Summer's, and the wedding is warm and strange and hopeful in a way Rick and Morty rarely allows itself to be. And then Tammy stands up and reveals that she is not a bride. She is a deep cover agent of the Galactic Federation, that she has been undercover for years specifically to use this wedding as a trap, and that the whole thing was a sting to round up the last of Rick's old rebel allies in one place. Then she pulls a weapon and shoots Birdperson dead in the middle of his own wedding, mid-sentence, without hesitation. The room erupts, Federation troops pour in, and a great many of the rebel guests are gunned down where they stand. It is really shocking the first time, partly because the show has spent an entire season teaching you that death does not matter, and then it stages a death it clearly wants to hurt. Birdperson is not a nameless guard or a Cronenberg stranger. He is the closest thing Rick has to a brother, and Tammy erases him between one word and the next. I will say plainly, this is the moment the series announces that its rules have exceptions, that not every death is a punchline, and that Rick has things left to lose. Now, two friends of Rick's get very different fates at that wedding, and people mix them up. Squanchy, the small cat-like alien whose entire vocabulary revolves around the word squanch, appears to go down fighting at the wedding and is widely assumed to have died there. He did not. Squanchy survives, and the series brings him back much later, alive and well. So if you have ever seen him listed among the wedding's dead, that is wrong. Birdperson is the one who dies. Squanchy walks away, and Birdperson's death does not stay simple, which is the other thing to hold on to. The Federation does not just leave his body. In the aftermath, revealed at the start of the following season, they recover him and rebuild him, turning the dead warrior into a cyborg soldier under their control, a resurrected weapon Rick and Morty calls Birdperson. So the friend Rick lost is not gone in the clean way Birdperson deserved. He is worse than gone. He is walking around as a machine wearing his own face, made to serve the people who killed him. That single thread, Birdperson dead, Birdperson rebuilt as a weapon, is going to run through 3 more seasons before the series is done with it, and it is one of the few places where the series lets a death metastasize into something truly tragic instead of resolving it with a portal and a shrug. The wedding does one more thing before the season ends, and it changes Rick himself. With his family now fugitives, wanted by the Federation because of their association with him, Rick makes a choice that is completely out of character for a man who claims to care about nothing. He turns himself in. He walks into a Federation prison and surrenders his freedom to lift the bounty off his daughter and his grandchildren, trading his own liberty for theirs. He does it while pretending in a voiceover that he is doing something clever, but this series frames it as what it plainly is, which is a sacrifice. The least sentimental man in the multiverse buys his family's safety with his own life, or what looks like the rest of his life. That is the note the second season ends on, and it is a very deliberate contradiction of everything Rick has told you about himself. He says nobody matters, then he goes to prison so that 4 specific people can matter a little longer. What makes all of this land is the contrast with the way Rick and Morty has been killing extras all season. We watched a whole miniverse die for a car battery. We watched a crowd get slaughtered so Morty could feel righteous about a cloud. And then the story spends its finale making sure you feel the death of exactly one bird-headed man, and it works because it withheld that feeling for so long. This is the series learning the trick it will use for the rest of its run. Kill thousands for comedy so that when it finally wants one death to hurt, the single body in the wedding hall lands harder than the thousands ever could. The second season is, in a lot of ways, an argument that scale is the enemy of grief, and that the only way to make a death mean something in a multiverse of infinite copies is to make you love one specific version before you take him away. The third season opens by cashing in the sacrifice from the wedding, and it does it with a body count so large it is easier to describe as an institution collapsing than as a series of deaths. The premiere is called The Rickshank Rickdemption, and it finds Rick imprisoned by the Galactic Federation, apparently broken, letting them dig through his memories. It is all a con. Rick escapes by hijacking the mind-scanning technology, swapping bodies through the guards, and eventually seizes control of the Federation's entire economy. And rather than fight them, he simply changes the number that defines their currency to 0. He makes their money worth nothing, instantly, everywhere. The Federation is not blown up so much as it is bankrupted into chaos, its society dissolving as the thing holding it together evaporates. Their occupation of Earth ends because there is no longer a functioning government to enforce it. It is one of the purest Rick moves he ever does, winning a war by breaking math instead of firing a shot. But the same escape sets off a massacre on the other side of the board. As part of his plan, Rick teleports the entire citadel of Ricks, the home of that society of thousands of alternate Ricks and Mortys, directly into the Federation's prison, letting his 2 greatest enemies grind each other apart. In the collision, the Council of Ricks, the ruling body of the whole Citadel, is wiped out. A Rick called Rick 4, one of the council leaders, is among the dead, along with countless other Ricks and Mortys caught in the crossfire. And here's the thing that makes this more than a comedic explosion. Killing the Council of Ricks removes the government of the Citadel. It leaves that entire society of alternate selves leaderless, frightened, and desperate for someone to follow. Rick, trying only to save himself, decapitates the leadership of an entire civilization, and in doing so, he digs the hole that a certain quiet, one-eyed Morty is going to climb out of a few episodes later. Rick does not know he has done it. That is what I find chilling about it. He clears the board for his own enemy without ever noticing the enemy was there. The middle of the season scatters its deaths across wildly different tones, and 2 of them are worth pausing on because they show Rick and Morty's range. The third episode, Pickle Rick, is famous for a stunt, which is that Rick turns himself into a pickle to get out of family therapy, and then, stranded as a pickle in a sewer, has to fight his way back to safety. What people forget is how much killing that little green cylinder does. He builds himself a body out of dead rats, wearing their corpses like a machine, and slaughters his way through a swarm of them, and then through the armed guards of a private security agency, and finally kills the agency's director. It is one of the bloodiest stretches in the entire series, and it is all in service of a man avoiding a conversation about his feelings. The therapist in that episode, in the one honestly still moment, tells Rick and the family something that hangs over everything else we are talking about tonight. She says that Rick's intelligence lets him treat every relationship, every emotion, every death as a problem beneath his attention, and that this is not strength, it is a way of hiding. The show does not usually diagnose Rick so directly. Here it does, and then it lets him win the argument by walking out, which is the point. The fifth episode, The Whirly-Durly Conspiracy, plays a completely different game with death, and it is one I want to define now because Rick and Morty reuses the idea. Rick takes Jerry to a resort built inside an immortality field, a zone where no one can die no matter what happens to them. Inside that field, Rick and Jerry are attacked, injured, killed, and revived over and over, their wounds meaning nothing as long as they stay inside the boundary. Death in that field is just a temporary inconvenience that resets, but the moment they cross outside its edge, the rules snap back to normal, and Rick uses that precise fact to kill the assassin hunting them, a man named Risado Groupon, by making sure his death lands on the outside of the line where it will actually stick. It is the clearest little demonstration the series ever stages of its own central obsession. Death only matters where the rules allow it to. Step inside the right field, or the right multiverse, or the right clone vat, and dying becomes a formality. Step outside, and it is permanent. Almost every death we discuss tonight is really a question of which side of that line the body fell on. By the time you have watched Rick end a galactic government by editing a spreadsheet, murder a swarm with a suit made of rats, and weaponize the exact border where death starts counting again, this series has fully established its thesis for the third season. Death is a system with rules, and Rick understands the rules better than anyone alive, and that understanding has cost him the ability to feel any of it. Which is precisely the setup for the episode where Rick and Morty turns his own machinery against a whole city of him. The fourth episode of the third season, Vindicators 3: The Return of World Ender, is one of my favorite death episodes in the whole series, because the horror in it is not the deaths themselves, but the state Rick was in when he arranged them. The Vindicators are the series' parody of a superhero team, a self-important league of galactic heroes who summon Rick and Morty to help them defeat a great villain called World Ender. Morty is thrilled. He loves these characters. And when the team arrives at World Ender's lair, they find that World Ender and all of his forces are already dead, killed the night before. Rick, it emerges, had shown up alone, blackout drunk, and single-handedly slaughtered the villain and his entire army with no memory of having done it. So the great threat the heroes assembled to face is already a pile of corpses before the episode really begins, which is the show's way of saying these grand hero versus villain stories are beneath the man they called in to help. But drunk Rick did not just kill World Ender, he built something. In his blackout state, he rigged the lair into an elaborate death game, a series of lethal trials modeled directly on the Saw films, complete with a tape-recorded version of himself acting as the sadistic host, quizzing the Vindicators on how well they actually know one another. And the trials start killing them. Vance Maximus, the team's arrogant leader and Morty's personal hero, is the first to go, dismembered in the vents while trying to escape, dying in front of Morty and destroying the boy's illusions in one stroke. A character called Crocubot, a crocodile-robot hybrid, is killed for getting one of drunk Rick's trivia questions wrong. The game is not random. Every trap is designed to expose the hypocrisies of these supposed heroes, to make them confess their affairs and their betrayals and their pettiness before it kills them. And the joke is that a completely unconscious Rick understood these people better than they understood themselves. The way the last two die is the sharpest part. It comes out through the game that two of the team members, Supernova and Alan Rails, have been having an affair, a betrayal exposed by the trials. And in the chaos, another hero, Million Ants, a being made of a swarm of intelligent insects, tries to defend Rick and Morty, and Supernova simply kills him for it. Then Supernova, with the affair now in the open and the loyalties of the team shattered, kills Alan Rails as well, murdering the man she was sleeping with to cover herself and clear her own escape. She walks out alive. So does the team's mascot, a lovable little creature called Noob Noob, whom everyone else had ignored and belittled the entire time. And the episode ends with Rick throwing Noob Noob a party specifically because he was the only one who was ever flatly decent. It is a strange, warm button on an incredibly grim episode, and I think it is the actual point of the whole thing. The heroes were frauds, and the only one worth celebrating was the janitor nobody respected. What makes this episode sit differently from the mass deaths we have already covered is that Rick was not present for it as a conscious person. He engineered a chamber that killed a room full of celebrated heroes while he was, by his own account, not even awake. It is the sharpest possible illustration of what the therapist told him one episode earlier, that his contempt for other people runs so deep it operates on autopilot, that even blackout drunk and remembering none of it, his instinct is to build a machine that exposes and murders everyone around him. He does not need to be trying to kill you. His indifference does the work on its own. Morty spends the episode losing his heroes one by one, and the person who took them from him is the same person standing next to him, who cannot even take credit because he plainly does not remember doing it. There is a detail I love about how the show frames the timing. Rick's greatest feat of the episode, wiping out World Ender and an army solo, happens entirely off-screen before we arrive, and we only ever hear about it secondhand. The show refuses to show you Rick being impressive. It only shows you the aftermath, the corpses, and the death game he left behind like a hangover. That choice tells you the series is not interested in celebrating how powerful Rick is. It is interested in the wreckage he leaves when nobody is checking. And Vindicators 3 is basically a whole episode built out of that wreckage, a crime scene Rick can walk through without recognizing his own handwriting on the walls. For Morty, it is another lesson in the thing this show keeps teaching him, which is that the adults he wants to look up to are either frauds or monsters, and the one who actually keeps him alive is the worst of them. The 7th episode of the 3rd season, the Ricklantis mix-up, is the one I would point to if someone asked me for a single episode that understands death better than any other in the series. It pulls a bait and switch on you. It opens with our Rick and Morty heading off on an adventure to a place called Atlantis, and then it abandons them completely. It does not follow them at all. Instead, it drops you into the rebuilt citadel of Ricks, the society that got its leadership massacred back in the premiere, and it tells 4 or 5 interwoven stories about ordinary Ricks and ordinary Mortys living inside that city. And what it shows you is that the Citadel is not a gathering of geniuses. It is a class system. There are Ricks working factory jobs, Ricks who are poor, Ricks who are cops, Mortys going to school, Mortis running for office, all of them trapped in a society built by and for the smartest man in the universe, and most of them living lives of quiet desperation inside it. The deaths in this episode are not comedy at all. They are the grinding cruelty of a system. There is a storyline about a Rick working a factory assembly line who dreams of something better. And it ends with the reveal that the most contented Rick of all, a figure called Simple Rick, whose artificial happiness is farmed and sold as a flavor additive, is a prisoner being tortured into producing false joy for the masses to consume. There is a storyline about 2 cops, a Rick and a Morty, patrolling the Citadel slums, and it ends with the Rick cop shooting the Morty cop dead in the street, after the Morty questions whether the whole system is even worth protecting. There is a Morty, called Big Morty, executed inside a facility that exists to break down Mortys who fail to conform. Everywhere you look, someone who is functionally the same person as our heroes is being crushed, exploited, or killed by a machine made of other versions of themselves. And then there is the election. The Citadel, leaderless since the massacre, is holding a presidential campaign, and one candidate is a Morty, which is almost unheard of, a Morty running to lead a society that treats Mortys as disposable. He gives soaring speeches about unity and change, and he wins, and his campaign manager, another Morty, is thrilled, right up until he discovers evidence that the candidate is not who he claims to be. The candidate has that manager quietly airlocked, blown out into space to keep the secret, and then he settles into power. And in the final moments, the new president turns, and we see the eye patch. It is Evil Morty. The quiet one from the first season finale, the one who walked into the crowd and vanished, has spent all this time climbing, and he has just been democratically elected to rule the entire society of Ricks. The episode ends with him ordering the execution of the members of the Citadel's Shadow Council who oppose him, and the final image is a slow drift past their corpses floating outside the Citadel's hull, set to a piece of music called For the Damaged Coda, which is one of the eeriest, saddest endings the series has ever done. I want to be honest about why this one gets me, because it is not the number of bodies, it is what the bodies mean. Every other mass death in this show is played for either comedy or spectacle. A miniverse for a battery, a wedding hall of rebels, a lair full of frauds. The Ricklantis mix-up is the one where Rick and Morty stops laughing and shows you that a society made entirely of the smartest and the least valued versions of two people would organize itself into exactly the same injustices as any other. That infinite genius does not produce a utopia, it produces a slum with a caste system. The Ricks built a wall around infinity to feel special, and inside that wall they recreated poverty, police violence, and political murder because the one thing a Rick cannot engineer his way out of is being a Rick. And the person who understands that best, who has been silently counting every one of those small cruelties, is the Morty who just took the crown. Evil Morty's rise here is the payoff of the vacuum Rick created in the premiere without knowing it, and it is worth saying clearly that not one of these deaths would have happened in this configuration if Rick had not decapitated the Citadel's government to save his own skin. He killed the council's absence created an election, and the election handed absolute power to the one Morty patient enough to win it. Evil Morty does not die here either, of course. He almost never does anything as vulnerable as being in danger. He simply consolidates, and the corpses drifting past the window at the end are, in a sense, the first installment of a bill that our Rick started running up the day he broke the Federation's economy and dropped a city of himself into a prison. The show is very almost unnoticed, building a case that Rick's carelessness with other lives is not victimless, that every shortcut he takes lands on somebody, usually somebody wearing his own face or his grandson's. It just takes the series a few years to send him the invoice. The rest of the third season scatters a few more deaths that are worth collecting before we move on, and a couple of them plant seeds that only sprout years later. Early in the season, in Rickmancing the Stone, the family, reeling from Beth and Jerry's divorce, escapes into a post-apocalyptic wasteland modeled on the Mad Max films, and Morty ends up with a new arm, a transplanted limb from a dead warrior. That arm has its own unfinished business. It belonged to a man whose family was murdered, and it spends the episode independently driving Morty to hunt down and kill the man responsible. A brute the wasteland calls Deathstalker so that a severed limb can complete a revenge its original owner never got to. It is a small, grotesque joke about how violence outlives the people who carry it, a dead man's vendetta still twitching through borrowed muscle. The 8th episode, Morty's Mind Blowers, is a strange anthology built entirely from deaths and traumas that Morty asked Rick to erase from his memory. Rick keeps a vast archive of these removed memories in vials, moments too painful or too shameful for Morty to keep carrying, and the episode plays them back one at a time. Several of them are deaths. In one, Morty, trying to be helpful, gives a scientist a piece of information so despair-inducing that the man kills himself in front of him, and Morty has the memory removed rather than live with the guilt. The framing device is the real gut punch because it reveals that Morty has under its breath authorized Rick to delete dozens, maybe hundreds, of his own worst experiences. That the cheerful boy we follow is only cheerful because a machine keeps carving the horror out of him. It is the series suggesting that surviving life with Rick is not something a person could do with their memories intact. You either forget or you break. Morty chose to forget. I should mention the 9th episode, The ABCs of Beth, even though nobody dies in it, because it creates one of Rick and Morty's most important living characters, and it matters for the death still ahead. In it, Rick offers Beth a choice. She can leave her life behind and go have adventures across the galaxy, and to do it safely, he will grow a clone of her to stay home and live her life in her place, so no one notices she is gone. Beth agrees. And crucially, after the clone is made, Rick erases his own memory of which Beth is the original and which is the copy, so that even he cannot say for certain. This gives us two Beths going forward, the one at home and the one this series eventually calls Space Beth, and I want to underline the canon fact here because people get it wrong constantly. Neither Beth is confirmed to be the clone. It is truly unknowable by design, because the one person who knew erased the answer from his own head. Both Beths are equally real, equally her, and both are alive. When we get to episodes where the Beths are in danger, keep that in mind. The show has made it impossible to say which one, if either, would be the lesser loss. And the finale of the season, the Rick-Churian Morty date, ends the arc of Rick's post-Federation freedom with a petty war between Rick and the President of the United States. What starts as a favor curdles into a grudge, and it climaxes with Rick fighting his way through the White House, killing a great many Secret Service agents and clones in the process. The bodies pile up in the halls of American power over what is essentially a schoolyard argument about respect. Two enormous egos willing to spend other people's lives to avoid apologizing. It is a smaller scale massacre than the Citadel, but it fits the season's through line perfectly. Because once again, the people who die are extensions of a system, faceless functionaries caught between two men who consider themselves too important to lose. The third season is, more than any other, about institutions, the Federation, the Citadel, the government, and about how each of them turns individual people into disposable parts. By the end of it, Rick has personally helped destroy or destabilize every large power structure in his life, and the cost of all that destruction has been paid, as usual, by nameless copies and functionaries whose deaths Rick and Morty barely slows down to register. Which is the setup for a season that finally starts asking whether any of this is doing Rick any good at all. The fourth season opens by handing Morty the ability to see his own death, and it is one of the bleakest arcs it has ever done with him. The premiere is called Edge of Tomorty, Rick Die Rick Pete, and it introduces an object called a death crystal. Hold one and you see every possible way your life could end, shimmering out in front of you like branching paths, and you can steer toward whichever death you find most appealing by making the choices that lead to it. Morty finds that in the futures where he dies old, peaceful, and beside the girl from school, Jessica, he has to make certain choices now, and he becomes obsessed with steering his life toward that one gentle ending. The obsession warps him. To protect the timeline where he dies happy, he starts making colder and colder decisions. And by the back half of the episode, he has become a fascistic, armored version of himself, willing to hurt or kill anyone who threatens the future he has decided he deserves. The crystal did not show him death so much as it corrupted him with the promise of a good one. While Morty is doing that, Rick is running the other half of the episode, and it is where the show finally names and fully explains a mechanic it has been softly using for years. Rick's consciousness is backed up. When his body dies, his mind automatically transfers into a fresh clone grown in a waiting vat, a system the series calls Operation Phoenix, and he keeps these backup bodies stashed across dimensions. We had seen a version of this before when Rick projected himself into a young clone body as Tiny Rick a couple of seasons earlier, but this is where the machinery is laid out plainly. In this episode, Rick's central body is knocked out of commission, and his consciousness goes bouncing from one backup to the next, except each vat he wakes up in belongs to a different, worse, more fascist alternate reality. He is forced to die again and again, sometimes to kill roomfuls of people, sometimes to take his own life, just to keep hopping toward a version of Earth where his real body still works. It is Rick and Morty literalizing its whole premise. Rick has made his own death so cheap, so routine, that he treats dying as a form of travel, a way to change the channel until he finds a reality he can stand. I think this pairing is one of the series' smartest structural jokes because it puts the two of them on opposite ends of the same idea. Morty becomes a monster chasing one specific perfect death. Rick becomes a tourist who cannot stay dead no matter how hard the universe tries to kill him. One of them treats death as a destination to be earned. The other treats it as a turnstile. And the episode in the background argues that both of these are ways of not actually living, that a boy micromanaging his deathbed and a man who has removed death's power over him entirely are both, in different ways, refusing to be present in the life they currently have. It is a lot of philosophy to smuggle into an episode with this many exploding heads, and it does it without ever slowing down to explain itself, which is exactly why it works. The rest of the season's front half keeps the deaths smaller and stranger. In The Old Man and the Seat, we meet a lonely alien named Tony, a being so private that he has built a secret toilet on an untouched planet purely so he can be truly alone while he uses it, and Rick, who shares that toilet planet, forms a prickly, wordless sort of friendship with him. It ends sadly. Tony dies, stranded and alone, and Rick is left having lost one of the very few people he ever let close without an agenda. In One Crew Over the Cuckoo's Morty, a heist movie parody, a rival master thief named Miles Knightley dies in the mayhem when Rick's heist-planning robot goes rogue, and the whole ecosystem of professional thieves turns on itself. And in Claw and Hoarder, the Dragon episode, a cellmate of Rick's named Chachi is killed in the opening, and a wizard is burned to death by combined dragon fire, dying slowly after freezing himself in a failed escape. These are the series in its comfortable middle register, killing supporting characters cleanly to keep an episode moving. But threaded underneath the whole fourth season is that opening idea, the death crystal, the backup vats, the endless respawns, all of it circling the same question. If you can see every death, and if you can survive any death, then what exactly is a death even worth? The season keeps asking, and it is about to start answering by killing things on a scale that makes even Rick uncomfortable. If there is a single running theme to the fourth season's deaths, it is genocide played as farce, whole species erased for a punchline, and this series commits to it with a straight face that I find honestly bracing. The clearest example is Rattlestar Ricklactica, the snake episode, which begins with Morty accidentally killing a single snake, an astronaut snake that had crash-landed on Earth, and spirals from there into a full Terminator-style time war. The snakes, it turns out, have a civilization, and they have time travel, and the death of that one snake sends their society into a cascade of assassinations and paradoxes across their own timeline. By the end, an entire species of intelligent snakes has been retroactively wiped out of existence by their own time police trying to fix the mess. An entire history unwritten because a bored teenager stepped on someone. It is a cause and effect joke stretched to a cosmic scale, and its punchline is that the value of a single life is impossible to calculate, because you never know whether the thing you casually killed was the load-bearing member of an entire civilization. Then there is Promortius, which parodies the Alien films, and which contains what might be the most efficient genocide Rick ever commits. Rick and Morty are captured by a species of facehugger-like aliens called the Glorzo, who use hosts to reproduce. Rick, once free, plays a single, sustained musical note that biologically compels the entire Glorzo species to breed uncontrollably, and they reproduce so explosively and so completely that they wipe themselves out in a frenzy, an entire civilization masturbating itself into extinction because Rick found the right frequency. On the way out, Rick's ship decapitates the Glorzo Queen almost as an afterthought. The show does not linger on it. A whole intelligent species is gone by the end of a cold open's worth of screen time, and Rick and Morty are already bickering about something else. I keep coming back to how casual Rick and Morty makes these because the casualness is the argument. To a being like Rick, wiping out a species is not a moral event. It is a chore, like taking out the trash. And this series wants you to notice how comfortable you have gotten watching him do it. The Vat of Acid episode takes the idea in a darker, more personal direction. Morty, tired of Rick belittling his ideas, asks Rick to build him a device that works like a save point in a video game, letting him return to an earlier moment whenever things go wrong. Rick builds it, and Morty uses it to live recklessly, dying and resetting, treating his own life and everyone around him as disposable drafts. And then, at the end, Rick reveals the horror underneath the gadget. It was never a save point. Every time Morty reset, the device did not rewind time. It annihilated the entire timeline he was leaving behind, every person in it, and dropped his consciousness into a fresh parallel one. Morty had not been undoing his mistakes. He had been genociding whole worlds full of people, over and over every time he wanted a do-over, and living blissfully unaware that the reset button was a doomsday weapon. It is one of the show's cruelest reveals precisely because it retroactively soaks an entire lighthearted episode in blood. Morty thought he was cheating death. He was mass-producing it, and Childrick of Mort closes out the season's genocide streak with something almost biblical. Rick discovers that Gaia, a planet-sized entity, is pregnant, effectively giving birth to a whole population of demigod children, and Jerry, of all people, ends up in a paternal role over them. Into this comes Reggie, a god figure, and Reggie is killed almost offhandedly, a spaceship driven straight through his head. His enormous corpse comes down on the newborn civilization the children had begun to build, crushing much of it, and Gaia's geological convulsions kill most of her own godchildren in the chaos. A pantheon is born and wiped out inside a single episode, with Jerry standing in the middle of it as the world's least competent father to a race of dying gods. Taken together, these 4 episodes form Rick and Morty's most sustained meditation on scale, on how completely it has trained you to feel nothing when a civilization ends. And I think the 4th season is at least partly aware that this is a problem, that it has made you numb because the very next thing it does, in its finale, is drag you back to a single death you were made to care about years earlier and force you to feel it all over again. The 4th season finale, Star Mort Rickturn of the Jerry, is the series collecting a debt it opened 2 seasons earlier, and it is one of the few times Rick kills someone out of something that looks like grief rather than convenience. The target is Tammy. You will remember her as the human woman who revealed herself to be a Galactic Federation agent and shot Birdperson dead at his own wedding. She has spent the seasons since as a committed enemy, still deep inside the Federation, still carrying the version of Birdperson they rebuilt. And in this finale, in the middle of a large operation, Rick finally gets his shot at her, and he takes it without ceremony. He kills Tammy with a single headshot. There is no monologue, no gloating. He simply ends the person who murdered his oldest friend, and the flatness of it is the point. This is the closest Rick comes to a revenge killing in the whole series, and he refuses to give it any of the theater that a revenge killing usually gets, because for Rick, letting it feel like an event would mean admitting how much Birdperson mattered. The finale also brings the Phoenix Person thread to a violent head. The cyborg made from Birdperson's corpse is active again, a rampaging machine wearing the face of Rick's dead friend, and it tears through the battle as a nearly unstoppable weapon. In the end, it is not Rick who stops it. It is the family. Beth, Jerry, and a newly arrived character work together to shut the cyborg down, disabling it rather than confirming it destroyed. I want to be precise here because Rick and Morty is deliberately careful. Phoenix Person is deactivated, powered down, not verified dead, and that ambiguity is intentional because the series is not finished with Birdperson and it wants to keep the door open. The thing that was made from the wedding's greatest loss is switched off and set aside, still unresolved, still technically salvageable, which is exactly the kind of half-death this show loves, a body that is neither properly alive nor cleanly gone. And this is the finale that fully establishes Space Beth as a lasting presence. The Beth who took Rick up on his offer back in the ABCs of Beth episode, the one who left to have adventures among the stars, comes home here as a hardened, blaster-toting freedom fighter, and she and the Beth who stayed have to share a life and a family without either of them or us ever being told which one is the clone. The show plays the reunion for tension and then characteristically refuses to resolve the question. Both Beths are here, both are real. Neither is confirmed as the original. It is one of the series' purest expressions of its own core anxiety, the fear that you might be a copy, that the person you love might be a copy, that there might be no fact of the matter at all, and the finale lets that fear walk around the house in 2 identical bodies rather than answering it. What I find most telling about this episode is the contrast between the 2 deaths at its center. Tammy, a person, gets a real death, sudden and permanent and earned, and Rick delivers it with the emotional flatness of a man refusing to grieve in public. Phoenix Person, a thing made from a person, gets a non-death, a power down, an unresolved question mark, because this series cannot bear to close the book on Birdperson and does not intend to. Between them, the finale draws the exact line the whole series keeps drawing, the line between the deaths that stick and the deaths that hover, between the losses Rick and Morty is willing to make permanent and the ones it keeps in a drawer marked maybe. Tammy killed a friend, so Tammy dies for good. Birdperson was the friend, so even the machine made from his body is allowed to stay ambiguous. Rick, who claims death means nothing, has clearly sorted the dead into those he will let go and those he will not. And that private sorting, more than any speech, is the truest thing the show ever tells you about how much he actually cares. The 5th season starts small and personal with its deaths before it goes cosmic, and the first one is almost a fable. In Mort Dinner, Rick sends Morty into a pocket dimension where time runs faster, a wine-aging dimension, to fetch bottles for a dinner party, and every quick errand for Morty is years of lived time for the people inside. Morty befriends a farmer there named Hoovy, and then, through a series of accidents on his repeated trips, gets Hoovy killed. And because time moves so fast in that world, Hoovy's death becomes a generational curse. Morty returns to find Hoovy's son grown and grieving, then that son's descendants, an entire bloodline organizing their whole civilization around avenging the man the boy from the sky killed. What is one careless afternoon for Morty is centuries of inherited hatred for them. It is the Snake episode's lesson told gently that a life you end thoughtlessly does not stay ended in the eyes of the people who loved it, and that Morty leaves a wake of grief behind him that he is usually moving too fast to see. And I will note, because people assume otherwise, that Mr. Nimbus, the Sea King who dominates the dinner party half of that episode, does not die. His whole plot resolves in a treaty. He is fine. The second episode, Mortyplicity, is the series at its most gleefully self-devouring, and it is essentially a feature-length meditation on everything we have discussed tonight about copies and disposable selves. The family is attacked by decoys, perfect duplicates of themselves, and it emerges that Rick had long ago built decoy versions of the whole family as a security measure, and that those decoys had built their own decoys, and those had built more, until there are countless identical Sanchez families out there, each one convinced it is the real one, and they go to war. The episode is a rolling massacre of Ricks and Mortys and Beths and Summers and Jerrys, dozens of families slaughtering dozens of other families, each Rick able to sense his own decoys dying, and the whole thing becomes a hall of mirrors soaked in blood. The genius of it is that Rick and Morty refuses to tell you cleanly which family, if any, is the original. It plants a subtle tell involving a detail of a road trip the decoys were not programmed to know about, but even that is the kind of clue you have to squint at. Mortyplicity is the series turning its own premise into a weapon against you, forcing you to feel the horror of a universe where you cannot be sure you are not the copy, and where the answer might flatly not exist. The third episode, A Rick Convenient Mort, gives us one of the season's most unsettling deaths because of who commits it and why. Morty falls for Planetina, an environmental superhero clearly modeled on the eco-conscious cartoons of an earlier era, a being summoned to protect the Earth. But her devotion to the planet curdles into extremism. To punish the people destroying the environment, she incinerates a mine full of coal workers, burning roughly 300 human beings alive in the name of saving the world. And Morty, horrified, watches the girl he loves become a killer. He ends up helping destroy the handlers who controlled and exploited her, the child managers this series calls the Tina Tears, and then he breaks up with her over the murders, choosing his conscience over his infatuation. It is a rare episode where Morty, so often the one dragging Rick toward mercy, has to be the one to draw a moral line, and the line he draws is against someone he loves. The show does not let environmentalism off the hook, and it does not let Morty off the hook either. It just sits in the discomfort of a hero who kills for a good cause and a boy who has to decide that a good cause does not make the bodies weigh any less. And then the fourth episode, Rick-Dependent Spray, is Rick and Morty at its most deliberately juvenile, and I mention it mostly to be complete. A scheme involving Morty's weaponized genetic material produces a plague of giant mutant monsters that rampage through Las Vegas, killing soldiers and civilians in large numbers, and the government's response involves growing an enormous clone of Summer as bait. That clone survives, launched into space as a recurring background gag for later seasons. There is not much thematic depth to mine here, and I would be inventing it if I claimed otherwise, so I will simply say that the episode adds a considerable body count to the season through pure gross-out spectacle, and move on to the parts of the fifth season that actually matter, because the back half of this season contains one of the 2 or 3 most consequential deaths in the entire series. And the setup for it starts with the show finally, mercifully, bringing back the friend it killed at a wedding 4 years earlier. Before the fifth season detonates its finale, it does something it almost never does. It reverses a death, and it does it with real tenderness. The episode is Ricketernal Friendshine of the Spotless Mort, and in it Rick goes looking for the deactivated remains of Phoenix-Person, the cyborg made from Birdperson's body, and rather than destroy it, he enters its mind. Inside Birdperson's memories, Rick has to navigate the wreckage of his oldest friendship, including the memory of the wedding, the moment Tammy shot him, replayed from the inside. And what Rick ultimately does is give Birdperson a reason to come back. He restores his friend to his organic self, brings him back from the machine, and tells him something that functions as the lifeline. He tells Birdperson that he has a daughter. It is true. Birdperson and Tammy had a child, and the knowledge that this daughter exists is what pulls Birdperson back toward wanting to live. So the friend killed at the wedding, rebuilt as a weapon, deactivated in a battle, is finally fully restored, alive and organic, and given a future. It is the series demonstrating that it can undo a death when it chooses to, which matters enormously because the very next major death it stages is one it will refuse, absolutely, to ever undo. That death sits at the center of Rick Mirai Jack, the 5th season finale, which is one of the key episodes in the series, for everything we are talking about. It resolves the Evil Morty arc, and it does so by explaining the secret architecture of the entire show. Evil Morty, still the president of the Citadel, reveals the existence of something called the Central Finite Curve. Let me lay out what it is, because it reframes the whole series once you understand it. The Ricks of the multiverse, faced with infinite universes, walled off a specific slice of that infinity, the exact set of universes in which Rick Sanchez is the smartest being alive, and sealed it away from all the others. Every reality we have ever visited in this show lives inside that curated bubble. The Ricks did it so that no Rick would ever have to live in a universe where he was not the smartest thing in it. It is, in Evil Morty's reading, the ultimate expression of Rick's ego, a man who reshaped infinity itself just so he would never have to feel small. And Evil Morty has spent his entire life trying to break out of it, because a universe designed entirely around Ricks is a prison for every Morty inside it. To escape, Evil Morty sabotages the Citadel's systems, and the result is the largest single massacre in the show's history. As the Ricks and Mortys of the Citadel try to flee, the portal fluid has been rigged so that escaping Ricks are routed into deadly dimensions, and the ones who try to use their backup body technology to cheat death are, in Rick and Morty's own grim phrase, blended into a kind of bloody milkshake, the Operation Phoenix trick defeated by making the transfer itself lethal. The vast majority of the Citadel's Ricks and Mortys die in this sequence, an entire society of alternate selves annihilated so that one Morty can walk out the far side of the wall. And he does walk out. Evil Morty breaks the Central Finite Curve, opens a path to the true infinite multiverse beyond it, and steps through, leaving the world of Ricks behind forever. I want to be as clear as I can because this is a common mistake. Evil Morty survives this one. He wins. He escapes. The people who die are the Citadel Ricks and Mortys, and Evil Morty walks free into the part of infinity no Rick was ever allowed to reach. Our own pair survive it, watching the person they could never catch simply leave. And folded into this same finale is the origin story that the whole series turns out to have been built on. In a flashback, we finally learn why our Rick is the way he is. Long ago, in his original life, Rick had a wife named Diane and a family, and another Rick, a Rick from a different reality who would come to be called Rick Prime, came to his home and murdered Diane. It is framed as the wound that made everything else. It was that murder that drove our Rick to invent portal travel in the first place, not out of scientific curiosity, but out of a mad, grieving hunt for the specific Rick who took his wife from him. The Citadel, the adventures, the nihilism, the endless disposability of everyone around him, all of it grew out of one man's inability to get over the murder of his wife and his decision to bury that grief under infinite universes rather than feel it. This is the reveal that recontextualizes the entire show. Rick did not become a god because he was curious. He became a god because he was in pain and looking for someone to kill for it. There is one detail here I have to get right because it is exactly the kind of thing that gets repeated wrong, and this channel has taken heat for the Diane storyline before. What Rick and Morty confirms is that Rick Prime murdered Rick's wife, Diane. The finer points of what happened to Rick's original daughter and how the Beth we follow relates to that original timeline are handled by the series with deliberate murkiness, and I am not going to paper over that murk with a confident answer I do not have. The load-bearing fact, the one that drives the next 2 seasons, is simple and devastating. Rick Prime took Diane from Rick, and Rick has spent his entire monstrous, brilliant, wasted life since then trying to find the man who did it. Everything you have watched him do, every casual death, every abandoned dimension, every friend he has kept at arm's length, has been happening in the shadow of that one grief he could never portal his way around. The 5th season ends with that grief finally named out loud, and with the villain who caused it, Rick Prime, still out there somewhere in the infinite dark, waiting for the seasons that will finally bring the two of them into the same room. The 6th season begins by cleaning up the mess the finale left, and in doing so, it confirms one of the key and most misunderstood facts about who these two people even are. The premiere is called Solarix because the Citadel's portal network was destroyed. A reset ripples out that sends everyone snapping back to their original home dimension. And this series uses this to settle the question of where the Rick and Morty we follow actually came from. Rick is flung back to the dimension designated C137, confirming that our Rick is, in fact, the original C137 Rick, the one whose Diane was murdered. But Morty is flung somewhere else. Morty is sent back to the Cronenberg dimension, the ruined world from the very first season that Rick and Morty abandoned after the love serum disaster. Because that is Morty's true home. Our Morty is not from C137. He is from the world we watched them destroy and flee in the 6th episode of the whole series. And in a detail Rick and Morty lets land like a quiet bomb, that same Cronenberg dimension turns out to be the home dimension of Rick Prime, the man who murdered Diane. Morty has been living all this time as a boy plucked from the ruined home world of Rick's greatest enemy. The reset also does something crueler and more consequential in the episode's final moments. Stranded in the Cronenberg dimension, Rick and Morty encounter that dimension's own Jerry, a Jerry the family had long since replaced and forgotten. And Rick Prime, watching, kills him. He murders the Cronenberg dimension's Jerry casually, remotely, almost as a note left for our Rick, a taunt to announce that he is still out there and still willing to reach into Rick's life and take pieces of it. It is a small death by the series' standards, one more Jerry among infinite Jerrys. But the series presents it as the starting gun for the whole season, because it tells our Rick and us that Rick Prime is not a memory. He is active, he is hunting, and the man Rick has spent his whole life trying to find has just proven he can find Rick whenever he likes. The 6th season becomes, from that moment, the long approach to the confrontation the 5th season promised. The 6th season also gives us a clean demonstration of the show's death-cheating logic taken to its philosophical extreme. In an episode where nobody real dies at all, but the question of death gets pushed to its limit. In it, Rick is trapped inside a full immersion virtual reality game, a simulated life so complete that he lives an entire lifetime inside it, grows old, builds a family, and forgets he is Rick. Death inside that simulation is not death. It is just the end of a session, and the horror the episode plays with is not dying, but the opposite. The temptation to stay, to accept a simulated life that feels real over a real life that feels like nothing. It belongs to a small family of moments in Rick and Morty, going back to a virtual life simulation arcade game in the 2nd season, where the series asks whether a death that can be undone by taking off a headset was ever really a death, and whether a life you can restart at will was ever really a life. The show keeps circling that drain because it is the same question underneath every clone vat and every replacement dimension. If nothing is permanent, is any of it real? Rick's whole existence is an experiment in answering no, and the series keeps without a word answering yes. Later in the season, in full meta Jack-Rick, Rick and Morty closes out one of its recurring antagonists in a way that fits its love of anticlimax. Story Lord, a villain who can manipulate narrative itself, who had been trapped in a story prison earlier in the series, breaks loose and threatens to bend reality into whatever tale he pleases. And after all that build-up, his end is deliberately pathetic. In the scuffle, Rick cripples him, and Story-Lord falls and dies, and the final indignity is that a Rick-branded plush toy ends up on top of his corpse. The great narrative manipulator killed and then buried under a piece of his enemy's merchandise. It is the series refusing to give even its cleverest villains a grand death, insisting instead that in a universe run by Rick, your dramatic arc counts for nothing and you will be squashed as casually as anyone else. But the 6th season is not really building toward Story-Lord or toward any of its Monster of the Week deaths. It is building toward a single quiet one, a death with no villain and no spectacle at all, the death that I think is the most human thing Rick and Morty has ever attempted. And that one deserves its own space. The 8th episode of the 6th season, Analyze Piss, contains a death so unlike the rest of this series that the episode opens with a content warning about suicide, which the series had never felt the need to do before. The character is a third-rate supervillain called Pissmaster, a man whose entire gimmick is exactly as ridiculous as the name suggests. And Rick and Morty introduces him as a joke, a pathetic loser in a costume that everyone, including Rick, mocks openly. Rick humiliates him publicly, tears him down online, treats him as beneath contempt, the way he treats every lesser mind that crosses his path. And then later, Rick goes to the man's home and finds that Pissmaster has taken his own life, sitting dead in a bathtub, having left everything behind. It turns out the ridiculous man in the costume was a widower, a single father, a person who was drowning, and the joke everyone had been laughing at was a human being at the end of his rope. I think this is the quietest, most devastating death the series has ever done, and it works precisely because it uses Rick and Morty's own cruelty against the audience. We were invited to laugh at Pissmaster, encouraged to see him as a disposable gag, and then the episode makes us sit in the room with his body and the daughter he left behind. And it does not let anyone off the hook, least of all Rick, and least of all us. The show that has genocided whole species for a punchline stops completely for one small, unsuper death. A man no one respected, gone by his own hand, and it treats it with a seriousness it almost never grants to anything. There is no reset here, no clone vat, no portal to a dimension where Pissmaster is still alive. He is simply dead, permanently, tragically, and the people around him have to carry it. Jerry, of all people, ends up entangled in the aftermath, briefly taking up the dead man's mantle, and the episode uses Jerry's fumbling sincerity as the counterweight to Rick's corrosive contempt. It is the show admitting that Rick's way of seeing people as beneath him, as jokes, as data, has a body count that does not show up in any of the spectacular massacres. Sometimes the person Rick's cruelty kills is just a sad man in a bathtub, and no amount of genius brings him back. The 9th episode, A Rick and King Mortar's Mort, deals with death in a completely different register, as ritual and duty rather than tragedy. It builds out the mythology of the sun-worshipping factions the series had been sketching, the Knights of the Sun, a culture organized around solar devotion, and it includes ritual suicides among the knights, deaths performed as acts of faith and honor rather than despair. The King of the Sun himself takes his own life as part of the ritual passing of the crown, choosing death to hand his authority to a successor, and for a stretch of the episode that successor is Morty. It is world-building as much as anything, expanding the strange religious corners of the series universe, but it sits in interesting contrast to Pissmaster 1 episode earlier. There, a suicide is the loneliest and most tragic thing imaginable. Here, suicide is framed as ceremony, as a culture's chosen shape for death, ritualized and meaningful to the people performing it. The show places these two treatments back to back, almost as if to insist that death has no single meaning, that the same act can be the bleakest despair or the highest honor depending entirely on the world it happens in. And the 6th season finale, Rickshonal Mortpoon's Rickmas Mortcation, ends on a death that turns out to be a sacrifice and a trick at once. Across the closing stretch of the season, there had been something slightly off about Rick, a softness, a patience that longtime viewers noticed. The finale reveals why. The Rick who had been spending time with Morty was not quite the real one. Rick had built a gentler robot version of himself, a robot Rick, to handle family life while the real Rick worked obsessively in secret on the one thing that actually consumes him. And that robot Rick, in the finale, sacrifices himself to save the life of President Curtis, giving up his own existence in an act of genuine heroism that the flesh and blood Rick would probably never have managed. Curtis survives because a machine built by Rick was a better man than Rick. And then the real Rick steps forward and reveals what he has secretly been building toward all season. He has been hunting Rick Prime, and his locator device, when he finally activates it, lights up not with one location but with countless simultaneous ones, because Rick Prime has decentralized himself across reality to be impossible to pin down. The season ends with Rick committing fully at last to the hunt for his wife's killer, and with Rick and Morty promising that the confrontation 2 seasons in the making is finally close. Everything has been narrowing toward one room, one Rick facing the other, and the 7th season is where the series finally opens that door. Before we get to the death that the whole series has been building toward, I should note a real-world change that hangs over the 7th season, stated plainly and without any speculation on my part about anyone's private life. The show's co-creator, Justin Roiland, who had voiced both Rick and Morty since the beginning, departed the series in January of 2023 after the 6th season. For the 7th season onward, both characters were recast, with new performers stepping into the 2 voices that had defined this series for a decade. It is a strange thing to carry into a season of television, 2 of the best-known voices in animation almost unnoticed replaced, and I mention it only because it is a documented fact of the show's production and because attentive viewers noticed. The writing carried on. The arc that had been building since the 5th season did not pause for it. The 4th episode of the 7th season, That's a Morta, is a death episode unlike any other in the series, because the deaths in it are not events but an industry, and the horror creeps up on you slowly. It begins with something cozy. The family loves Rick's Thursday spaghetti, a weekly tradition, a really warm domestic ritual in a show that does not have many. And Morty, curious about where Rick gets it, follows the supply chain to its source, and what he finds unravels him. The spaghetti is made from corpses. Specifically, it comes from the bodies of a human-like alien species. And the detail that makes it unbearable is this: their insides turn into edible spaghetti only when they die by suicide. Not by any death, by that one. Rick has been sourcing the family's favorite meal from the bodies of beings who have taken their own lives, harvesting the physical product of their despair and serving it at the dinner table as comfort food. What the episode does with that premise is where it becomes one of Rick and Morty's sharpest pieces of writing. Morty, horrified, insists the practice has to stop, that you cannot build a food supply on the corpses of the hopeless. But the reveal spirals outward into a genuine ethical trap because the alien society depends on this. When Morty tries to expose the truth and end the harvest, the planet's response is not to stop, but to industrialize, to begin manufacturing despair deliberately, engineering the conditions that produce suicides at scale so the supply never runs dry. Morty's compassion does not save anyone. It converts a grim accident into an organized machine. It is the same lesson Rick and Morty has taught since the 2nd season, that Morty's instinct to fix things tends to make them worse. But here it is aimed at something much heavier than usual, at the way real systems of food and labor are built on suffering we agree not to look at how exposing a cruelty is not the same as ending it and can even deepen it. I think it is one of the bravest half hours the show ever made because it refuses the comfortable ending. There is no version where Morty's goodness wins. There is only the choice between a hidden horror and an efficient one. The reason That's a Morte matters so much in a survey of the series' deaths is that it is the series thinking directly about suicide as a subject, one episode after it had already done so with Pissmaster in the previous season, and coming at it from the opposite direction. Pissmaster was one death, intimate, specific, a single man in a bathtub whom the series forced you to grieve. The spaghetti aliens are suicide as a statistic, as a resource, as something a civilization has learned to look away from and then, worse, to farm. Put side by side, these 2 episodes form the show's most serious, sustained engagement with the subject, and neither of them offers any comfort or any reset. Nobody comes back. Nobody is cloned. There is no dimension where these deaths did not happen. The show, which spent years teaching you that death is cheap and reversible and funny, deliberately builds its late seasons around the exact deaths that are none of those things, the ones that stay dead, the ones that mean something, as if it is slowly confessing that the death is cheap philosophy it sold you was always a coping mechanism and never the truth. And it is in exactly that mood, having stripped away every death cheat it ever taught you, that it finally stages the confrontation between Rick and the man who killed his wife. The 5th episode of the 7th season, Unmortricken, is the payoff of the entire series, the death Rick and Morty had been circling since it first told you Rick's wife was murdered, and it delivers on it with a brutality that is entirely earned. Rick finally corners Rick Prime, the version of himself who came into his home all those years ago and killed Diane. And the confrontation is helped along by an unexpected ally because evil Morty, out beyond the central finite curve and free of the whole world of Ricks, has his own reasons for wanting Rick Prime destroyed. The two of them, our Rick and evil Morty, work together to strip Rick Prime of everything that makes him hard to kill. Rick Prime, like our Rick, has backup clone bodies and a healing factor, the same death cheat technology we have watched Rick use for years, and evil Morty methodically dismantles all of it. He destroys the backups, he removes the healing, he turns Rick Prime for the first time into a man who can actually die. And then our Rick kills him with his hands, not with a gadget, not with a portal, not with some clever trick. He beats Rick Prime to death, physically, personally, the way you would kill someone you have hated for a lifetime, and the series lets it be as ugly and unglamorous as that sounds. There is no immortality field to reset it, no vat to bring him back, no dimension, one universe over where Rick Prime is still breathing, because evil Morty made sure of that first. Rick Prime is permanently, absolutely dead, and the arc that drove the entire series, the hunt that built the portal gun and the citadel and the whole shape of Rick's ruined life, is over. The permanence is what makes this death matter. Rick Prime does not get the death cheat. The show deliberately closes every escape hatch it spent 8 seasons installing, specifically so that this one death of all deaths will stay dead. It is the only way the revenge could mean anything. But the episode contains a second, larger, colder revelation, and it is the single most important fact in this entire video. The one I need you to take away above all others, because it is the fact this channel has been corrected on before, and I am not going to get it wrong. Before he dies, we learn exactly what Rick Prime did, and how completely he did it. He did not simply kill the Diane of our Rick's home dimension. He used a weapon called the Omega device, and the Omega device does something this series had never allowed before. It erases its target from every single reality at once, across the entire infinite multiverse, all of it in one stroke. It does not kill one version of a person. It unwrites every version of them everywhere so that no variant, no copy, no alternate, no dimension-hopped replacement can ever exist again. Rick Prime demonstrates the weapon's power on screen by erasing a minor character, Slow Mobius, from all of existence in an instant, wiping every version of him out of the multiverse to prove the point. And what Rick Prime used that weapon on, long ago, was Diane. So here is the fact. Stated as plainly as I can state it, Diane is gone from every reality, not dead in one universe and alive in another, the way everyone else in this show is, erased from all of them. There is no dimension our Rick can portal to where his wife is still alive, because the Omega device made sure such a dimension cannot exist anywhere in infinity. This is the one loss in the entire series that Rick and Morty's central death cheat cannot touch. Every other death we have talked about tonight has a loophole. A dead Rick has infinite living copies. A dead Birdperson can be rebuilt and revived. A dead Morty can be replaced from the Citadel's assembly line. But Diane cannot be found, cannot be copied, cannot be visited, cannot be reached in any universe ever, because a weapon specifically designed to defeat the infinite copies logic of this entire show was used on her and on her alone. If you have ever heard someone say that Rick could just go to a world where Diane is still alive, they are wrong, and Rick and Morty went out of its way to make them wrong. The Omega device exists in the story for exactly one narrative reason: to make Diane's death the one death that infinity cannot undo. There is a bitter symmetry in how evil Morty walks out of this. He helped our Rick get his revenge, but he did not do it as a favor. While Rick was busy beating Rick Prime to death, evil Morty scanned the schematics of the Omega device out of Rick Prime's mind, took the plans for the one weapon in the multiverse that can erase anything from all of infinity, and then destroyed the physical device and walked away with the knowledge in his head. So the confrontation that ends Rick's revenge arc also arms the one character the story has never been able to contain with the most dangerous weapon it has ever depicted. Rick gets his ending, evil Morty gets the future, and Diane stays erased. The immovable fact at the center of everything, the one death the smartest man in infinite universes cannot reverse, no matter how many worlds he tears open looking. After Unmortriken, the great question that drove the series is answered, and what is left is the far harder question the remaining seasons have to reckon with, which is what a man does with the rest of his life once the thing he built that life around is finally, permanently finished. The rest of the 7th season lets the pressure out with a run of smaller deaths, and a couple of them are worth collecting before the finale, which handles death in a way I want to be very precise about. In Rick Fending Your Mort, Morty causes a death that drags the family into a cosmic legal system. He shoves a being called an observer into traffic, killing it, and it turns out the observers are a species that exist to watch, to witness reality, and killing one is a serious enough crime that Rick and Morty are put on trial for it. It is a smaller episode, but it plays with a nice idea that in a universe this saturated with casual death, there might still be a category of being whose death actually registers as an offense, a species whose only purpose is to see, murdered by a boy who could not stand being seen. In Wet Quad A Mortican Summer, a parody of the film Total Recall, the deaths pile up in the usual mid-season way. A mortician is killed, a character named Quiet dies, and a trafficking boss named Kenneth is drowned by Rick, held under until he stops moving, in the kind of direct, hands-on killing Rick tends to reserve for people he has personally decided deserve it. In Rise of the Numbercons, styled as an in-universe animated movie in the vein of the Transformers films, characters with names like Magma Q and Emperor Dreadnought die in stylized battle, and an entity called Infinity carries out a massacre. But the whole thing is bracketed as a film within Rick and Morty, deaths at one further remove from the reality the series usually pretends to. And in Mort Ragnarok, the series returns to its death cheat playground one more time, sending Rick, Morty, and a Bigfoot character into a scenario where dying just funnels them into an afterlife that works as an infinite energy source, so they die and respawn repeatedly with no permanence at all. Rick even kills Jerry at one point purely as an experiment, because in that context, death is just a variable to test. Nobody stays dead. It is this series reminding you, one last time before the finale, of the exact philosophy it is about to interrogate. Because the 7th season finale, Fear No Mort, contains no real deaths at all, and this is one I need to get exactly right, because there is a specific misunderstanding about this episode that I would rather correct than repeat. The finale takes place around something Rick and Morty calls the fear hole, a device that generates illusions of a person's deepest fears. Anything that comes out of the fear hole is not real. It is a projection, a manifestation of what the person confronting it is most afraid of, and the drama of the episode is entirely psychological. There are no genuine deaths in it, only illusory ones, fears given temporary shape. And the detail that matters most for our purposes is this: somewhere in that confrontation, the possibility of an illusory Diane appears, a fear projection of the wife Rick lost, and Rick refuses it. He does not chase her. He does not enter the illusion to be with her. He recognizes that whatever the fear hole could offer him is not real, and he turns it down. I am flagging this deliberately because it would be easy and wrong to say that Rick went into the fear hole and found Diane, or that he reunited with her there. He did not. There is no real Diane anywhere, as the Omega device made permanent, and the illusion of her is precisely the thing Rick is strong enough, or broken enough, to walk away from. The finale is about a man declining to comfort himself with a fake version of the only person he ever truly lost. I find that a remarkable place for the 7th season to end because it is the show closing the loop on its entire relationship with death. For 8 seasons, Rick's answer to loss was to cheat it, to portal around it, to replace the dead with copies and drown the grief in infinite universes. And here, offered the ultimate cheat, an illusion of Diane that would feel completely real and ask nothing of him, he says no. This is the first time in the whole series that Rick chooses the permanence of a death over the comfort of undoing it. And I think the series means it as a kind of growth, bitter and small and hard-won, but real. The man who built a philosophy out of death being cheap has arrived at the one death he will not cheapen. Not even to ease his own pain, not even when the universe hands him the loophole for free. Everything the 7th season does with its throwaway respawns and its illusory fears is really in service of that one refusal, Rick standing in front of a fake Diane and letting her stay fake, because the real one is gone and he has finally, at enormous cost, decided to let gone mean gone. The 8th season, which aired in 2025, carries the aftermath of the Diane arc while returning to the series' more chaotic instincts, and I will treat its deaths with a little more caution than the earlier seasons simply because they are newer and less thoroughly picked over. The premiere, Summer of All Fears, is worth flagging for what it is not because it is full of deaths that do not count. It traps Summer and Morty inside a simulated life that runs for something like 17 years of subjective time. An entire adolescence and young adulthood lived inside a machine, and although people die within that simulation, none of it is real in the show's terms. It is another entry in the long line of virtual and simulated lives the series keeps returning to. Another test of whether a death you can wake up from was ever a death at all. The season opens, in other words, by reminding you how much of this show's dying is provisional, which makes the truly permanent losses that follow land a little harder. The second episode, Valkyric, moves into real casualties. A Gromflamite queen is murdered and Space Beth is framed for the killing, which drives the episode's plot. The actual culprit is a character called Fantabulous, who dies in the course of the story, impaled on the horn of one of the larger Gromflamite casts and then finished off by an explosion. The Gromflamites, the insectoid soldiers of the old Galactic Federation, have always been Rick and Morty's most disposable cannon fodder, dying in swarms across multiple seasons. So a story that hinges on the death of their queen and the framing of Beth for it is Rick and Morty, giving those background aliens a rare moment of narrative weight. Space Beth, carrying the accusation, also keeps alive the series' refusal to ever fully separate the two Beths into a real one and a copy, since the peril and the guilt attach to her exactly as they would to any version of the character. The third episode, The Rick, the Mort, and the Ugly, returns to the wreckage of the Citadel, which even after its near total destruction has apparently been partly rebuilt into a new Citadel, and it stages another mass death among the alternate selves. A figure the series calls Homesteader Rick detonates himself, a suicide bombing that destroys the rebuilt new Citadel and a great many of the tyrant Ricks and Mortys operating it, and in doing so halts an operation trafficking in Mortys. It is grimly fitting that even a rebuilt Citadel meets its end in mass death, as though this series is arguing that any society made of Ricks is structurally doomed to collapse into atrocity and then destruction, no matter how many times you rebuild it. The Citadel dies, in one form or another, again and again across this series, and it is always Ricks and Mortys dying by the thousands to make the point that a civilization of the same broken man cannot hold. The fourth episode, The Last Temptation of Jerry, plays death for absurd comedy in the old style. Jerry runs over and kills the Easter Bunny, which turns out to be an invasive alien, and the twist is that whoever kills one of these creatures becomes one. So Jerry begins transforming into the very thing he killed. His transformation is eventually reversed, so it does not stick, but the episode is a clean little parable about how killing a thing can turn you into it, dressed up in one of the show's silliest premises. And the fifth episode, Cryomort, a Rickver, stages a class war story aboard a sleeper ship, a vessel of frozen passengers, and among its casualties is a character called Chachako, ejected into the vacuum of space, dying while grabbing at a lump of valuable hypercoal, killed by his own greed as much as by the cold. The 8th season, at least in its front half, is Rick and Morty cycling back through all its old registers of death at once. The simulated and unreal, the disposable alien swarm, the doomed citadel, the absurd comic transformation, and the greedy functionary flung into the dark, as if taking inventory of every kind of dying it has ever done before it brings the Diane story to its final rest. The second half of the 8th season keeps that inventory going and then, at the very end, returns to Diane one final time. The 6th episode, The Curious Case of Benjamin Button, is largely a chaos episode with no permanent deaths, built around the Beths de-aging and the mayhem that follows, so I will leave it there rather than stretch it into something it is not. The 7th episode, Rickerthan Fiction, is more interesting for our purposes because it plays elaborate games with death and resurrection inside fiction. Rick and Morty end up inside a movie, and the episode stages what it openly frames as a Disney-style villain death for the two of them. The kind of clean, bloodless fall that animated films use to dispatch a bad guy, and then simply resurrects them, because inside a story, deaths are whatever the story needs them to be. Elsewhere in the same episode, a zombie version of a character called Baron Thistle is killed by Rick with a shovel, a blunt, physical, comic death set against the slick artifice of the movie deaths. The show contrasting the messy reality of killing something with the weightless convenience of fictional death. It is the series doing, in miniature, the exact thing it has been doing to you for 8 years, showing you a death that costs nothing and asking whether you even noticed it was fake. The 8th episode, No Mortland, kills a Jerry, and specifically a version the series calls Boss Jerry, a more competent and ambitious Jerry than our own. He meets his end when Rick and Morty collapse a bag-of-holding portal, a pocket space, with him trapped inside it, sealing him away in a collapsing dimension. It is another Jerry death in a show that has treated Jerrys as almost infinitely expendable. But this one carries a small sting because Boss Jerry represents the version of the character who actually got his life together, and Rick and Morty disposes of him anyway, as if to insist that even the Jerry who succeeded is not safe from the casual cruelty of Rick's universe. And the 9th episode, Morty Daddy, stages a death that turns out to be a lie, which I want to note carefully so it does not go on the list of real ones. Morty Jr., the character from an early season, appears to be shot dead in a place called Garbtopia, but it is revealed to be faked, a publicity stunt staged to promote the sequel to his novel. Morty Jr. is alive. His death is a marketing hoax, and the series uses it to poke at how death has become just another content strategy, a stunt you fake for attention, which, in a series this saturated with real and unreal dying, is a fittingly cynical note. And then the 8th season finale, Hot Rick, closes the Diane arc with something that is not quite a death, but is entirely about one. There is no literal killing at the center of it. Instead, the fallout of the Omega device and the permanent erasure of Diane comes home to roost inside the family. Constructs of memory appear, a memory Rick and a memory Diane, echoes of the dead wife and of Rick himself, and they very nearly drive Beth to take her own life. The grief and the wrongness of these memory figures, becoming honestly dangerous to her. Rick's solution is characteristically strange and characteristically cold. He ejects these memory constructs into space, sealing them away in an ant farm pod, a tiny contained world flung out into the dark. What the finale reinforces, under its breath and finally, is that Diane exists nowhere in reality anymore. What remains of her is only a memory echo, a construct, a dangerous ghost that has to be locked in a pod and thrown away because it cannot be allowed to stay and it cannot be turned back into the woman it imitates. The show, having spent a whole series establishing that death is cheap and reversible, ends its 8th season on the image of the one person who cannot be brought back, reduced to a memory so unbearable it has to be shot into the void. I think that is a flatly brave way to close out this stretch of this series because it refuses every comfort the series had trained you to expect. There is no reunion, there is no dimension where Diane waits. There's not even a clean grief, just a memory construct so painful it becomes a hazard to the living, sealed in a jar and discarded. Across the 8th season, Rick and Morty runs through every kind of death it knows, the simulated, the disposable, the faked, the fictional, the comic, and it saves for last the one death that is none of those things, The one it has spent 8 seasons proving is the exception to all its own rules. Diane does not come back. Diane cannot come back. And the family's task by the end of the 8th season is not to undo that loss, but to survive it, to lock the ghost away and keep living, which is the plainest and most human thing this deeply strange show has ever asked its characters to do. Now that we have walked through every season, I want to step back and lay out the full toolbox, because part of what makes death in this show so slippery is that Rick has assembled an entire arsenal of ways to cheat it, and understanding how they fit together changes how you read every corpse we have discussed. The first and oldest tool is the one the whole series is built on, dimension hopping, the trick from the very first season where a dead Rick and a dead Morty can simply be replaced by living versions from a neighboring reality who slot into their lives and bury the evidence. This is the foundation, and it is worth saying plainly that it is not really cheating death for the individual. The Rick and Morty who died in that garage stayed dead. What got cheated was continuity, the family's ability to notice they had lost anyone. The trick does not save a life. It replaces one, which is a colder and stranger thing, and Rick and Morty never lets you forget the difference. The second tool is the one that comes closest to true personal immortality, the clone backup system, Operation Phoenix, where Rick's consciousness auto-uploads into a waiting body the instant he dies. This is the real death cheat, the one that lets the same Rick keep being the same Rick across a chain of bodies. And it is why our Rick can throw himself into suicidal situations with a shrug. But even this has a horror built into it, because a backed-up mind is a copied mind, and the series keeps poking at the question of whether the Rick who wakes up in the vat is the man who died or just a very convincing replacement who thinks he is. The third tool is the immortality field, a localized zone where death simply cannot occur, which Rick and Morty uses to demonstrate its whole thesis in miniature, that death is not a fixed law but a set of local rules Rick can suspend or exploit. The fourth is the save point device, the video game gadget that turned out to be a timeline annihilation weapon, death disguised as an undo button. And the fifth is cybernetic resurrection, the Phoenix person route, where a corpse is rebuilt into a machine, neither cleanly alive nor cleanly dead. Then there is a whole category that is not really death at all but keeps getting mistaken for it, and I want to separate these out because it matters for an honest accounting. The Meeseeks do not die when they vanish, because vanishing is their entire nature, the completion of a purpose rather than the ending of a life. The virtual and simulated lives, the arcade game where you live a full existence, and the later full immersion simulation are not deaths because dying in them just removes the headset. And the danger they pose is the opposite of death, the temptation to stay in a comfortable fake forever. The toxic and healthy split from an earlier season where Rick and Morty are divided into two versions of themselves ends in a re-merging, not a killing. None of these are deaths, and a careful accounting of the series has to keep them in a separate column, because if you count every vanishing Meeseeks and every simulated casualty as a death, Rick and Morty's body count becomes meaningless, which is arguably the point this series is making about itself. It has manufactured so much fake and reversible dying that real death struggles to register. And standing over all of it, defeating the entire toolbox in a single stroke, is the Omega device, the weapon that erases a target from every reality at once. I explained what it did to Diane, and I want to place it now in relation to everything else, because its whole horror is that it is the answer to every death cheat Rick ever built. Dimension hopping fails against it because there is no replacement Diane in any dimension. The clone backup fails against it because there is no template left to copy. The immortality field, the save point, the cybernetic rebuild, all of them assume that some version of the target still exists somewhere to be recovered or restored, and the Omega device is specifically designed to make that assumption false. It is the one tool in Rick and Morty that works in the opposite direction from all the others, a device for making death total in a universe where death is normally partial. Rick spent his life building machines to make death mean less. Rick Prime built one machine to make a single death mean everything, and used it on the one person Rick could not stand to lose. What I find really revealing about this whole arsenal is what it says about Rick as a person, because a man does not build this many redundant systems for surviving death unless he is terrified of it. The nihilist who claims nothing matters has, in fact, engineered more defenses against his own ending than any character in fiction. Backup bodies in vaults across dimensions, escape routes through infinite realities, fields where he cannot be harmed. The philosophy and the machinery contradict each other completely. If death truly did not matter, you would not need this much insurance against it. And I think the writer knows this and builds Rick's entire arc around the gap between what he says about death and what he has actually built to avoid it. He tells Morty that dying is nothing, and then he goes home to a garage full of anti-death technology beyond anything else in the universe. The talk is armor over the machinery, and the machinery is armor over the same terror every person carries, made monstrous by the resources of a god. And the cruelest joke the show plays with all of it is that none of the machinery made him happy. He can survive anything, and he is miserable. He can replace anyone, and he is lonely. He built a wall around the entire infinite multiverse to guarantee he would never meet a Rick smarter than himself. And inside that wall, he is the saddest man alive. The toolbox works perfectly. Every device does exactly what it was designed to do. And the sum total of a life spent defeating death is a man who tried to kill himself in a garage in the second season, and who, 6 seasons later, stands in front of an illusion of his dead wife and declines to comfort himself with it. The show's final position on the death cheat, I think, is that cheating death is not the same as being alive, and that a man who has removed every consequence from his own existence has also, without meaning to, removed most of its meaning. The tools all work. That was never the problem. The problem is the man holding them, who learned to defeat death so thoroughly that he forgot how to be moved by it, and spent the rest of the series slowly, painfully learning that skill back. Since this is meant to be a complete accounting, I want to spend some time sorting the dead from the not dead, because the series delights in blurring that line, and a lot of people walk away from it believing certain characters died who are alive, and certain characters are safe who are permanently gone. Let me start with the ones who stay dead, the short and heavy list, because it is much shorter than the series' chaos would suggest. Diane is gone from every reality, erased by the Omega device, the one truly unfixable loss. Slow Mobius, the minor character Rick Prime erased to demonstrate that weapon, is gone the same way, a piece of collateral proof of the device's power. Rick Prime himself is permanently dead, beaten to death after his backups, and healing were stripped away first, which is the only reason it stuck. Tammy is permanently dead, killed by Rick to avenge the wedding. Pissmaster is permanently dead, a suicide with no reset and no clone. Storylord is dead. And the vast population of Citadel Ricks and Mortis killed in the finale of the 5th season, and again in the new Citadel's destruction in the 8th, are gone in numbers too large to grieve individually, which is exactly why Rick and Morty uses them as a mass rather than as people. That is close to the whole list of deaths this series treats as truly final. Everything else has an asterisk. Now the corrections, the characters people are sure died who did not, because getting these right is the difference between an accurate accounting and the kind of confident mistake that this channel has been called out for before. Mr. Poopy Butthole did not die. Beth shot him in the Parasite episode, but he survived, he was never a parasite, and he remains a real and recurring friend of the family. Squanchy did not die at the wedding. He appeared to fall in the massacre, but he survived and returned seasons later, alive. Birdperson did die at the wedding, but he did not stay dead. He was rebuilt as Phoenix Person, deactivated, and then fully restored to his organic self, and he is alive, with a daughter. Mr. Nimbus did not die in the Wine Dimension episode. His conflict ended in a treaty. Both Beths, the one at home and Space Beth, are alive, and it is canonically unknowable which of them, if either, is the clone. So anyone who tells you the real Beth died, or that one of them is definitively the copy, is asserting something the series deliberately made impossible to know. And Morty Jr., in the 8th season, only appeared to be shot dead, staging his own death as a publicity stunt, and is alive. The correction I most want to repeat, because it is the single fact most worth getting right in this entire subject, concerns Diane and the shape of Rick's grief. You will hear people say that Rick could simply travel to a universe where Diane is still alive. that with infinite realities at his fingertips, there must be a world where his wife survived, and that his refusal to go there is a choice or a character flaw. That is wrong, and it is wrong because of the Omega device. There is no universe where Diane lives. Rick Prime did not kill one Diane, he unwrote all of them across the entire infinite multiverse in a single act specifically designed to close that exact loophole. Rick cannot go to a world where Diane is alive for the same reason he cannot travel to a color that does not exist. The world is not hidden or hard to reach. It has been deleted from the set of all possible worlds. This is not a fan interpretation, it is the plain mechanism this series built into its 7th season, and it is the entire reason the Omega device exists in the story at all. If you take one fact from this video, take that one. And then there is the strangest category, the ambiguous by design dead, the deaths Rick and Morty refuses to resolve on purpose. Which Sanchez family survived the decoy war in the 5th season, the true original or the last surviving copy, is left unknowable, with only a faint clue about a road trip to gesture at an answer the show never confirms. Which Beth is the clone is unknowable, because the one person who knew erased his own memory of it. Whether the Rick who wakes up in a clone vat is the same man who died is a question the series raises and never answers. These are not failures of the writing, they are the writing, because the show's deepest anxiety is not death itself, but the suspicion that identity is so cheap and so copyable that death loses its meaning, that you could die and be replaced, and no one, including you, would be able to prove anything was lost. The ambiguous deaths are where Rick and Morty is most honest about its own fear, which is not that people die, but that in a universe of infinite copies, dying might not even be the kind of event that can be said to happen to a specific person at all. When you lay it all out this way, a pattern emerges that I think is the real key to the whole show. The deaths that stay dead are, almost without exception, the ones tied to love or to genuine cruelty. Diane, whom Rick loved, Birdperson, whom Rick loved, is the exception that got a reversal precisely because Rick loved him enough to go into his mind and drag him back. Pissmaster, whose death the series forces you to actually feel. The permanent deaths are the ones that carry weight, and the reversible ones are the ones that do not. Which means this series has without fanfare built a universe where the cheapness of death is real. But grief is the part that makes a death stick. A Rick can survive anything except mattering to someone. A death only becomes permanent when the story decides it should hurt. That is the rule underneath all the machinery, and it is a strangely humane rule for such a nihilistic show, because it says, in the end, that what makes a life real is not whether it can be copied, but whether someone would grieve if it were gone. There is one figure who has been standing at the edge of nearly every mass death we have discussed, and I want to trace his whole path in one place. Because Evil Morty is Rick and Morty's single most sophisticated statement about death, and he makes it by never dying and by causing more of it than almost anyone. Follow him from the beginning. He first appears as the quiet mastermind behind the murder of dozens of Ricks in the 1st season finale, the small, one-eyed boy who removes his controller and vanishes into the crowd. He resurfaces as the president of the Citadel, rising to power on the vacuum Rick created, and consolidating that power by having his own campaign manager airlocked and the Shadow Council executed, their corpses drifting past the windows. He returns to sabotage the Citadel entirely, engineering the deaths of most of its Ricks and Mortys so he can break the central finite curve and escape. And he reappears one last time to help destroy Rick Prime, walking away with the schematics for the deadliest weapon in the multiverse. Everywhere the body count spikes, he is there, calm, patient, and completely untouched. What makes him remarkable is not the killing. Plenty of characters in this show kill on a massive scale. What makes him remarkable is that he is the only one who understood the game well enough to quit it. Every other character in the series, above all Rick, is trapped in the death machinery we have been describing. Cheating death, replacing the dead, respawning, hopping dimensions, all of it a frantic effort to keep playing a game whose rules Rick himself designed. Evil Morty looked at that entire system, the Citadel, the Curve, the infinite curated universes where Rick is always the smartest man alive, and he recognized it for what it is, a prison built by one man's ego, and rather than try to win inside it, he broke the wall and left. He is the only character who does not want a better position within Rick's world. He wants out of Rick's world entirely, and he is willing to spend any number of Ricks and Mortys to buy that exit. The deaths he causes are not cruelty for its own sake, and they are not comedy. They are the price of escape, paid in the only currency the Citadel ever valued, which is disposable copies of two people. I find the contrast between Evil Morty and our Rick to be the sharpest thing Rick and Morty ever set up, because they are, in a sense, the same insight pointed in opposite directions. Both of them understand that in a universe of infinite copies, individual life is cheap. Rick responds to that knowledge by building an empire of death cheats and drowning his grief in nihilism, staying inside the system and mastering it. Evil Morty responds to the same knowledge by refusing to participate, by treating the whole infinite curated bubble as a cage and walking out of it. Rick wants to never lose. Evil Morty wants to never play. And the story, tellingly, lets Evil Morty win, lets him be the one character who, across the seasons we have covered, is never cornered, never killed, never even seriously threatened, the one who steps outside the story's central conflict and is last seen walking free. In a series obsessed with death, the closest thing to a victor is the one person who found the exit from the machine that generates all the dying. One more thing about him, said plainly, because he is the subject of a lot of loose talk. Evil Morty again walks away untouched. Not in the first season finale, not in the Citadel Purge, not when he breaks the curve, not in the confrontation with Rick Prime. Through everything we have walked tonight, he stays alive, and as the 8th season closes, he is still free and beyond the boundary of the world we watch, having come out of the Rick Prime confrontation with the schematics of the Omega device in his head. Across these seasons, the series never once shows his death, and it goes out of its way to keep him from ever being cornered. Anyone who tells you Evil Morty died is filling a gap the series deliberately left open, and the openness is the point, because a story about the cheapness of life needs one figure who cannot be cheapened, one Morty the machine could never grind down, and that is who he is. He is the control group. In a universe where every Morty is interchangeable cannon fodder and camouflage for a Rick, he is the one who refused the role, and the reward Rick and Morty gives him for that refusal is the one thing it gives no one else, a clean escape with his life intact. There is a darker reading available too, and I suspect the series wants both to be true at once. Evil Morty may be free, but he bought that freedom with an ocean of death, and he walked away carrying the single most dangerous weapon the series has shown, the one device that can make a death total and permanent across all of infinity. The character who best understood how meaningless mass death had become is now the character best equipped to make a death mean everything, and the 8th season leaves his arc open without telling us what he means to do with that knowledge. So the one figure who escaped the death machine walks off, at least for now, carrying the key to the only weapon that ever defeated it, and that is either the brightest or the bleakest note in this stretch of the series, depending on the day you watch it. What is not ambiguous is that he lived, that he alone in this whole graveyard of a show walked out the far side untouched, and that his survival is the series' quiet argument that the one way to beat a system built entirely around death is to stop playing it, no matter what it costs to leave. For all the attention this series pays to Rick's relationship with death, I think the more almost unnoticed tragic story running underneath every season is what all of this dying does to Morty, and it is worth pulling that thread out on its own because it is a death Rick and Morty never labels as one. When you meet Morty in the first episode, he is a frightened, stammering, fundamentally gentle boy, someone whose instinct in every dangerous situation is to try to help, to save the alien, to spare the creature, to find the compassionate way through. Watch him across the seasons we have covered, and you can see that boy being killed by inches. He kills Fart and learns that mercy gets people slaughtered. He watches his heroes die in the Vindicator's death game and learns that the people he looks up to are frauds. He drives a man to suicide and has the memory surgically removed so he can keep functioning. He steers his own life with a death crystal until he becomes a fascist. He shoots the eco-hero he loves or helps destroy her handlers and walks away from her over the killing. Each of these is a small funeral for the person Morty used to be. The memory erasure episode is the clearest evidence of this, and it is the one I keep coming back to, because it reveals that the cheerful Morty we follow is a managed illusion. The archive of removed memories, the vials of trauma Rick keeps, is proof that Morty could not survive this life with his experiences intact, that the sole path to keep him functional is to periodically carve the worst of it out of his head. So the boy at the dinner table is not a boy who has made peace with the horror. He is a boy who has had the horror deleted over and over, a person maintained rather than healed. And I find that truly sadder than any single death in the show because it means Morty is dying continuously, losing pieces of himself on a schedule, and the version of him we love is partly a fiction stitched together by an old man with a memory-erasing gun who would rather edit his grandson than let him feel what this life actually costs. By the later seasons, the gentle boy is mostly gone. The Morty who exposes the spaghetti horror is not naive. He is grimly certain that the truth has to come out even when it makes everything worse. And he is right that it makes everything worse. The Morty who shoves an observer into traffic, the Morty who has watched thousands of versions of himself die on the Citadel and understood exactly what he is worth in Rick's universe, is a harder, colder, more knowing person than the one who cried over a burial in the first season. And the series is honest enough to present this as loss rather than growth. Morty does not become wise, he becomes armored in the same way Rick is armored, which is the show's bleakest suggestion. That proximity to Rick does not teach you to be like Rick because you admire him, but because the alternative is to feel the full weight of everything the two of you have done, and no one can carry that. Morty is becoming Rick not by choice, but by exposure. The way you would develop a callus, and every death he witnesses or causes is another layer of scar tissue over the boy he was. What complicates this and what keeps it from being simply grim is that Morty is also the one who keeps drawing lines. He is the one who insists the spaghetti has to stop even knowing the cost. He is the one who breaks up with someone he loves over 300 murders. He is the one whose horror at the Vindicators, at the memory of a man he drove to suicide, at the truth of what his save point was really doing still registers as horror. The boy is being killed by inches, but he is not dead yet, and Rick and Morty locates most of its actual hope in that fact. Rick lost the ability to be moved by death long before the series began. Morty is losing it slowly, in front of us, and the fact that he has not lost it completely, that he still flinches, still objects, still grieves, is the closest thing the series has to a beating heart. As long as one of them can still be horrified, this series is not fully the nihilist machine it pretends to be. I think that is why Rick and Morty keeps pairing them so deliberately in its death episodes. Rick who feels nothing, and Morty who still feels too much. Because the tension between them is the tension the whole series is about. Every death is a small tug of war over which way Morty will go, toward Rick's armor or away from it. And the accumulated weight of 80-some episodes of dying is the show slowly, honestly showing you a good kid being worn down into someone who can survive a universe this cruel, and asking, without ever answering, whether survival on those terms is worth what it costs. The deaths in this show are not really about the people who die. They are about what watching them die does to the boy standing next to the man who does not care, and whether by the end there will be any of that boy left. That, more than Diane, more than Rick Prime, more than the whole graveyard of Ricks, is the death the series is actually about, the slow one, the one with no funeral, happening to Morty a little more in every episode. I want to talk about the comedy of it now, because we have spent a long time on the deaths that hurt, and it would be dishonest to pretend Rick and Morty is not, first and most often, a comedy that finds death hilarious. Most of the dying in this series is a punchline, and the technique behind that is worth understanding because it is doing something more deliberate than shock. The show's basic move is a mismatch between scale and tone, where the size of a death and the emotional weight it receives are wildly, comically out of proportion. An entire species breeds itself to extinction, and the characters are already arguing about lunch. A universe full of intelligent life is snuffed out to protect a car battery, and the scene plays it as a mild inconvenience. A cheerful assassin with a whole personality is introduced and then flattened mid-sentence. The joke is never really the death itself. The joke is the gap between how much a death should matter and how little anyone on screen can be bothered to care. And that gap is funny in the way that the truly bleak things are funny, because laughing is the only alternative to being crushed by it. There is a real argument to be made that this is desensitizing, that a show which stages genocide for a chuckle every few episodes is training its audience to feel nothing about mass death. And I do not think that criticism is stupid, but I think the series is smarter than that criticism gives it credit for, because it uses the numbness deliberately as a setup. It spends most of its runtime teaching you to laugh at bodies precisely so that once or twice a season, it can show you a death it does not want you to laugh at, and the contrast does the emotional work that ordinary drama would need 10 times the build-up to achieve. Pissmaster's suicide lands like a physical blow, specifically because you were laughing at him one scene earlier. The spaghetti reveal turns your stomach because the episode began as a warm family dinner. Birdperson's murder at the wedding shattered viewers because this series had spent 2 seasons proving it did not care about anyone. The comedy is not the opposite of Rick and Morty's emotional power. It is the delivery system for it. The numbness is a loaded spring, and I think there is something almost honest in that structure, something truer to how death actually works than a solemn drama would be, because in a large enough world, death really is mostly statistics and shrugs, and the moments that break through and honestly hurt are rare and specific and usually catch you off guard. The show's tonal whiplash, the way it can go from a species-wide extinction played for laughs to a single suicide played for tears within the same season, is not incoherence. It is a fairly accurate model of how a person moves through a world saturated with death they cannot afford to feel. Most of it sliding past as background noise, a little of it landing and staying forever. Rick lives permanently in the shrug, Morty lives in the flinch, and the series' comedy and the show's grief are not 2 different modes. They are the 2 ways the same universe processes the same overwhelming fact, which is that everyone dies, constantly everywhere, and you cannot survive caring about all of it. The music is worth mentioning here because Rick and Morty uses it as a precise instrument for telling you which deaths are which. Most of the dying happens with no score at all, or with comedic stings, disposable sound for disposable bodies. But a handful of times this series drops in a piece of aching, sincere music underneath the death, and those are the ones it is telling you to feel. The corpses drifting outside the citadel to the sound of a mournful cover of an old song is the clearest example. An entire sequence of political murder scored like an elegy, and the dissonance between the casual brutality on screen and the tenderness of the music is what makes it unforgettable. The show knows exactly what it is doing. It withholds sincerity almost all the time, so that when it finally offers a real melody over a real loss, you understand instantly that this one is different, that this one counts. It has trained you to read its tone like a language, and death is the vocabulary it uses that language to speak. What I take from all of it is that the comedy is not a way of avoiding death. It is a way of surviving having thought about it this much. This is a show made by people who clearly find mortality flatly terrifying and plainly absurd at the same time, and who refuse to pick one because both are true. It is terrifying that we die, and it is absurd that we spend our brief time pretending we will not, and a show honest enough to hold both of those at once has to be a comedy, because a straight drama would collapse under the weight and a straight comedy would be a lie. Rick and Morty found a third thing, a way to laugh at the void that is not denial but a kind of eye contact with it. And every genocide for a punchline is part of the same project as every death that made you cry. They are the series looking directly at the thing everyone else looks away from and choosing most of the time to laugh, because the laugh is what lets you keep looking. There is an asymmetry in this show's deaths that I do not think gets talked about enough, and it runs right through the middle of the family, dividing them into those for whom death is cheap and those for whom it is as final as it is for any of us. Rick can hop dimensions and wake up in clone vats. Morty is the endlessly reproduced camouflage of the Citadel, a boy who exists in industrial quantities. But Beth, Jerry, and Summer have none of that machinery. They are ordinary people attached to a man who treats death as a scheduling problem, and for them it is not a scheduling problem at all. When a Jerry dies, he is simply dead. There is no Jerry backup vat, no Operation Phoenix for a man like him, and Rick and Morty makes a running joke of exactly this, of how many Jerrys die across the multiverse and how little anyone notices, culminating in Rick Prime murdering a Jerry as a taunt and the series calling one deceased Jerry the multiverse's most accomplished, which is a joke that only works because Jerrys are understood to be the least valued people in all of infinity. But I think this series is doing something sharper than mocking Jerry with all of this. It is drawing a class line, the same class line it drew inside the Citadel, between the beings who have engineered their way out of death's reach and the beings who have not. Rick built himself a kind of immortality, and everyone in his orbit lives with the daily fact that he could survive things that would erase them permanently. Jerry, in particular, is Rick and Morty's portrait of a fully mortal man standing next to a functionally immortal one, and a lot of the contempt Rick aims at him is really contempt for mortality itself, for the ordinary human limitation of being a person who gets one life and then ends. When Rick sneers at Jerry, he is partly sneering at what Jerry represents, the condition Rick spent his genius escaping, the condition Rick is secretly terrified he never actually escaped at all. Jerry is what a Rick would be without the machinery, and I think Rick cannot stand to look at him for exactly that reason. Beth carries a different version of the same weight because her relationship to death got tangled up with the clone question, and it changed her permanently. Once Rick offered to replace her with a copy so she could go have adventures, and once she took that deal, Beth had to live with the possibility that she herself is the copy, that the original Beth is out among the stars and she is the manufactured stand-in, or the reverse, with no way to ever know. That is a specific kind of death anxiety that only this show could produce. The fear not that you will die, but that you might already be a replacement for someone who effectively did, that your whole life might be the afterlife of an original you can never meet. The show never resolves it, and Beth has to build a self and a family and eventually a relationship on top of that unanswerable question, which is its own quiet form of courage. She decides to be real by choosing to live as if she is, because the alternative, waiting for a proof that will never come, is a way of being dead while alive. Summer, the one Rick and Morty sometimes forgets, actually has the healthiest relationship to death of anyone in the family. And I think that is deliberate and underrated. She grew up inside this madness. She has seen the graves and the clones and the dimension hops, and rather than being broken by it like Morty or armored against it like Rick, she has mostly metabolized it into a kind of steady, sardonic resilience. She grieves when grief is warranted, and she shrugs when a shrug is warranted, and she is rarely fooled by either the comedy or the sentimentality the show uses on everyone else. If Morty is the boy being slowly killed by proximity to Rick, Summer is the person who found a way to stand near the same fire without being consumed by it, and the series softly holds her up as proof that it is possible, that you can grow up inside a universe this saturated with death and come out the other side as a functioning, feeling adult, rather than a monster or a casualty. Put the family together and you get the series' real emotional architecture, which is a single mortal household orbiting a man who has opted out of mortality, each of them working out a different survival strategy for living beside someone who cannot die the way they can. Jerry copes by staying oblivious and sincere. Beth copes by choosing to be real. Summer copes by staying clear-eyed. Morty copes by being edited. And Rick copes by pretending none of it matters while building ever more elaborate defenses against the one thing he insists is meaningless. The deaths in this show, the spectacular ones and the tragic ones and the comedic ones, all happen around and to this family, and the deepest thing the series has to say about death is not in any single killing, but in the daily arrangement of these 5 people, 4 of whom will really die someday, and 1 of whom might not. Sitting at the same dinner table, eating spaghetti none of them want to ask too many questions about, holding together a family built on a grave. That image, more than any body count, is the show's actual subject. If you pull far enough back from all of it, every death we have walked through tonight turns out to be downstream of a single one. And I think that is the truly remarkable thing about how this show is built. Trace the causality. A Rick loved a woman named Diane. Another version of himself murdered her. That murder is the thing that made our Rick invent portal travel, not out of curiosity, but out of a need to hunt the killer across every reality. The portal gun made the multiverse accessible, which made the Citadel possible, which made the whole society of Ricks and the whole economy of disposable Mortys possible. It made dimension hopping possible, which is why a dead Rick and Morty could be replaced in a backyard in the first season. It made the central finite curve possible, the wall Rick built so he would never feel small, which made evil Morty's whole rebellion possible. Every institution, every death cheat, every mass grave of alternate selves, every adventure, every casual genocide, all of it grew out of one man's refusal to accept one death. The show is a cathedral built on a single grief, and it took 8 seasons to show you the foundation stone. That is why the Diane reveal recontextualizes everything rather than just adding backstory. Before you know it, Rick looks like a nihilist who happens to be powerful, a man who does terrible things because he can and because nothing matters to him. After you know it, every one of those terrible things reads as a symptom. The drinking, the cruelty, the refusal to let anyone close, the compulsive disposal of whole populations, the insistence that death is meaningless, all of it becomes the behavior of a man in unbearable, unresolved grief, who found a way to make his pain the size of the universe so he would never have to feel it at its actual human size. He did not become a god because he stopped caring. He became a god because he cared about one thing so much that losing it broke him, and building infinity was easier than mourning her. The most powerful being in the multiverse is a widower who could not face his loss, and so he made a machine large enough to hide inside. And the reason Rick and Morty could only end this arc by killing Rick Prime and confirming Diane's total erasure is that those two facts, together, take away the last thing Rick's grief was using to avoid becoming grief. As long as Rick Prime was alive, Rick had a mission, a hunt, a way to keep his pain pointed outward as rage instead of inward as sorrow. And as long as the multiverse was infinite and uncensored, there was the theoretical loophole, the fantasy that somewhere out there a Diane still lived and the loss was not truly total. The 7th season takes both away at once. It lets Rick kill the man, which ends the mission and leaves him with nothing to point the pain at. And it confirms the Omega device erased Diane from everywhere, which closes the loophole and makes the loss as absolute as a loss can be. What is left, once the revenge is done and the fantasy is foreclosed, is just a man and his grief with no machine left to hide it behind, which is exactly why the 8th season has to be about memory constructs and a family surviving rather than about any new enemy. The plot ran out because the grief finally had nowhere left to run. I think that is an almost bold thing for a comedy about a drunk scientist and his grandson to have been secretly building toward for over a decade, and it reframes Rick and Morty's reputation. People came to Rick and Morty for the sci-fi and the jokes and the nihilism, for the coolness of a man who did not care, and the series spent years letting them enjoy that surface while in the background assembling, underneath it, one of the more thorough portraits of grief in modern television. The nihilism was never the message. The nihilism was the symptom this series was studying. Every time Rick told Morty that nothing matters, Rick and Morty was showing you a man lying to a child and to himself. And the whole series was the slow, patient work of proving that the man did not believe it. That a person who truly thought nothing mattered would not have spent a lifetime and an infinity hunting the one person who took the one thing that did. Rick's actions always contradicted his philosophy, and the contradiction was the point, and the Diane reveal is the show finally telling you out loud what the contradiction was hiding. So when someone asks what Rick and Morty is actually about, underneath the portals and the aliens and the endless clever violence, I think the honest answer is that it is about a death, one death, the death of a woman we barely see, and about the lengths a person will go to in order to not feel it, and about how those lengths can be the size of a universe and still not be far enough. Every other death in the series, the thousands of Ricks, the burning miners, the spaghetti aliens, the bird-headed friend, the sad man in the bathtub, the whole numberless graveyard we have spent these hours walking through, is in some sense an echo of that first one, a variation on the theme of loss that Rick and Morty cannot stop returning to because its central character cannot stop running from it. The deaths are not the subject. The grief is the subject. The deaths are just the shape the grief takes when a genius decides he would rather remake reality than mourn. One of the things you notice when you walk the deaths in order, the way we have tonight, is that the series' whole relationship with death matured over its run, and I do not think that maturation was an accident. The early seasons are giddy with death in a way that reads, looking back as a young show showing off, delighting in how much carnage it could stage and how little it would sentimentalize any of it. The Anatomy Park corpse fireworks, the casual erasure of a miniverse, the flattening of Krombopolis Michael, these are the deaths of a series that has just discovered it can do anything and is testing the limits, enjoying the shock, wearing its refusal to care as a badge. And for a while, the culture met it there. A lot of the show's early reputation was built on that coolness, on the appeal of a character who was too smart to grieve and a show that was too clever to flinch, and plenty of viewers took the nihilism at face value and made it a personality. But watch the deaths keep coming season after season and something shifts. The show starts staging deaths it clearly does want you to feel, and it starts staging them more often. And it starts building whole episodes around the deaths that cannot be laughed off or undone. The distance from the corpse fireworks of the first season to the suicide of a lonely man in a bathtub with a content warning attached is enormous, and it is not just a change in subject matter, it is a change in Rick and Morty's whole posture toward death. The series that once treated a dead species as a punchline learned over years to stop and sit in a single death and refuse the joke. And I do not think that is the series losing its nerve or going soft. I think it is this series growing up, the same way its audience did, aging out of the phase where not caring feels like strength and into the harder understanding that not caring was always a pose, and that the brave thing, the mature thing, is to let a death land. The clearest sign of this maturation is what the later seasons do with the death cheats themselves. Early on, the reversibility of death was a source of fun, a toy, a way to have your cake and eat it, kill anyone and bring them back, hop to a new dimension when yours breaks. But by the later seasons, Rick and Morty is actively dismantling its own toys, one by one, insisting on permanence where it used to offer escape hatches. It kills Rick Prime and refuses him a respawn. It confirms Diane is gone from everywhere and cannot be retrieved. It shows a suicide with no reset and a food supply built on deaths that stay dead. The show spent its youth building an arsenal of ways to make death not count, and it spent its maturity taking that arsenal apart as if it had come to distrust the very premise that made it famous. That is a rare and difficult thing for a long-running series to do, to turn against its own founding gimmick, and Rick and Morty did it slowly and deliberately, until Rick and Morty about death being cheap had become a show about the one death that was not. There is a real-world layer to the series' longevity that I will state plainly and without embroidery because it belongs in any honest account. The series ran for many years and many seasons. It survived a change in its two lead voices between the 6th and 7th seasons after the departure of its co-creator, and it kept telling the story it had been telling, carrying the Rick Prime arc and the Diane arc across that transition without abandoning them. Long-running shows usually decay, repeat themselves, lose the thread. What is notable about this one, from the vantage of a death-by-death walkthrough, is how much the through line held, how the seeds planted in the first season finale and the second season wedding were still growing seasons later, still paying off, still building toward the confrontation the whole thing was pointed at. The show earned its ending in the oldest way there is, by planting things early and being patient enough to let them come due, and the deaths were the plants, the losses were the seeds, and the harvest was a grief the series had been cultivating since before most viewers realized it was growing anything at all. I think that is why Rick and Morty has the cultural place it does, why it outlasted the meme phase and the backlash phase and settled into something more durable. It looked for a long time like the ultimate expression of a certain kind of detached, ironic, nothing matters sensibility, and it turned out to be a patient argument against exactly that sensibility, a decade-long demonstration that the man who says nothing matters is the man most wounded by how much things do. A generation watched it for the coolness of not caring and got, over the years, an education in why not caring was never available to anyone, least of all to the character who claimed it loudest. The deaths were the curriculum. Every corpse played for a laugh, and every corpse played for tears, was teaching the same lesson from two directions: that you cannot actually opt out of mortality or grief no matter how smart you are, and that the attempt to opt out is the saddest and most human thing a person can do. The show made you laugh at death for years so that by the end, you would understand your own laughter and what it had been protecting you from the whole time. There is one more thread I do not want to leave out because it is the darkest one and the series is quieter about it than almost anything else, and that is Rick's relationship with his own death. We have talked about all the machinery he built to survive dying, the backups and the fields and the dimension hops, and it would be easy to conclude that he built all of it because he wants to live. But watch him closely across the series and the opposite keeps surfacing. This is a man who tried to kill himself in his garage in the second season, in that still, unbearable scene I mentioned earlier that ends with no joke. This is a man who, chained to his backup bodies in the fourth season, was forced to take his own life over and over across a chain of realities and treated it as a chore rather than a horror. This is a man who, when this series digs into his interior, keeps circling the same wish, which is not to live forever but to stop. And that is the genuine paradox at the center of him. Rick has made himself nearly impossible to kill, and he does not seem to want to be alive. He built immortality for a man who has, more than once, wanted to die. Once you see that paradox, a lot of his behavior reorganizes around it. The recklessness, the throwing himself into situations that would kill anyone else, is not only confidence in his backups, it is a man repeatedly daring the universe to finish him, disappointed each time that it cannot. The drinking is a slower version of the garage. The cruelty and the isolation are the behavior of someone who does not think his own continued existence is worth much and cannot understand why anyone would value theirs. And the immortality machinery itself takes on a terrible second meaning, because a suicidal man who has made himself unable to die has built himself the cruelest possible prison, a life he does not want that he cannot end. The death cheats are not a gift he gave himself. They are a sentence. He is condemned to keep surviving by his own hand, the very thing he keeps trying to escape, and there is no darker joke in the whole series than that. The smartest being in infinite universes trapped in the one cage he cannot think his way out of, which is simply being alive when you would rather not be. This is why his refusal of the illusory Diane in the 7th season finale reads to me as the defining beat in his entire arc, more than killing Rick Prime, more than any of the spectacle. A suicidal man is offered a perfect illusion of the one thing that could comfort him, the return of the person whose loss is the root of everything, and he says no. He chooses to keep living in the real world with the real absence rather than retreat into a beautiful fake, and for a man who has spent the whole series preferring any reality to the one he is in, that no is enormous. It is the first moment Rick chooses the painful real over the painless unreal, the first time he decides that a life with the grief in it is worth more than a comfort without it. It is a very small step for a person and a very large one for this particular person, and to my mind the series means it as the closest Rick will ever come to choosing to live, not because life stopped hurting, but because he finally decided the hurt was his and worth keeping. I find that really moving, and I did not expect to from a show that started with corpse fireworks over the suburbs. The arc of Rick's own death wish, from the garage to the fear hole, is the story of a man learning, incredibly slowly and against his every instinct, to stay. Not to want to stay exactly, just to stay, to keep surviving the survival he trapped himself in, and to do it by the end, without the fantasy of an undo. The show never lets him off the hook, never gives him a tidy healing, never pretends the grief resolves. It just shows him in that final refusal, choosing the real world one more time, and lets that be enough, because for Rick, choosing the real world at all, even once, even badly, is a kind of victory the whole series had to earn. He is still the man who buried himself in a backyard in the first season. He has just finally decided to climb out of the grave and sit in the daylight, which is more than the man in the garage could have imagined doing, and about as much peace as a show this honest was ever going to allow him. So that is the long walk, every death in Rick and Morty that carries weight, from the very first bodies buried in the dark to the one absence that infinity itself cannot fill. And if you have stayed with me this far, drifting somewhere between waking and sleep, I hope what settles over you is not the body count, but the strange, sad shape underneath it. Because when you lay all of these deaths side by side, the thing that lasts is not the carnage. It is the quiet realization that a show which killed more characters than almost anything on television turned out to be, all along, a show about how much a single loss can matter, and about a man who could rebuild the universe but could not rebuild the one thing he actually wanted back. I think that is why it stays with people the way it does, why it grew from a late-night cartoon about a drunk scientist into something a lot of us carry around and rewatch and argue about years later. It let us laugh at death for a decade, easily, thoughtlessly, the way we all do when we are young and death is theoretical. And then it grew up in front of us and made us understand our own laughter and forgave us for it, and asked us to feel the thing we had been laughing to avoid. It never lectured, it just kept killing people, some for a joke and some for a wound, until the difference between those two things became the whole point, and until you could not tell the story of Rick and Morty without telling the story of what it means to lose someone and keep going anyway. That is a lot to smuggle inside a show with a talking gas cloud and a pickle. And it is the reason it will outlast most of what it aired alongside. There is something fitting about ending a video like this in the dark, at the edge of sleep, because that is the honest register for a subject like this one. Not loud, not dramatic, just the calm acknowledgement that everything ends, that the ending is usually smaller and stranger than we expect, and that the people worth grieving are the ones we would rebuild a universe to keep. Rick could not save Diane. None of us can save the ones we lose. What the show offers, in the end, is not a portal out of that fact, but a kind of company inside it, the company of a story that looked directly at death for 100 episodes, and came back with the oldest and simplest news there is, that love is what makes a death matter, and that mattering is worth the pain of the loss. Hold on to the people who would grieve you. That is the whole lesson, hidden under all that blood. Rest easy tonight. Let the quiet do its work, and let the weight of the day go the way all things eventually go. Thank you for spending these hours here in the dark with me, and thank you, as always, for letting this channel be the thing that walks you down into sleep. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.